She was rejected by her own mate, humiliated in front of her pack, and left to die beyond enemy lines. They called her weak. They called her broken. They called her nothing. But here's what no one understood about a woman who has spent years learning how to survive in silence. She was never weak. She was patient, and patience, in the right hands, is the most dangerous weapon in the world. Stay until the end of this story. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Because what happens next is going to hit different depending on how much you've ever had to survive alone. The morning Celine Vale turned 23, nobody remembered. Not the packhouse kitchen staff who had watched her eat alone at the long servants' table for the past 4 years. Not the senior warriors who passed her in the stone corridors without breaking stride, eyes sliding off her face the way eyes slide off furniture. Not the women who gathered in the eastern courtyard each dawn to run their drills, their laughter loud and deliberate, perfectly calibrated to carry through the window above where Celine did her stretches in silence. And certainly not Cale Draven, alpha of the Shadowfang pack, who had not looked directly at his own Luna in 6 weeks. Celine knew the exact count, 6 weeks and 2 days. She had stopped counting hours somewhere around week 3. The packhouse sat at the heart of Shadowfang territory, a fortress of black stone and old timber that smelled permanently of wood smoke and wet fur, and it rose from the hillside like something that had grown there rather than been built. The pack's banner, a wolf mid-leap, silver against black, hung from every tower. Celine had walked beneath those banners every single day for 4 years and never once felt like they included her. She dressed without a mirror. She had learned early that mirrors in the Shadowfang packhouse were not objects of neutral reflection. They were instruments of comparison, and the comparison always ran the same direction. Reyna Voss was taller. Reyna Voss had hips built for bearing alphas. Reyna Voss had fully shifted at 15, a clean and brutal transformation that had reportedly cracked 2 of the training ground's stone pillars when her wolf first hit the earth. Celine, by contrast, had never fully shifted. Her wolf existed somewhere inside her like a word she could not quite pronounce, present but trapped, pressing against the inside of her ribs some mornings until she had to press her palm flat against her sternum just to remind herself she was still breathing. She laced her boots in the cold light coming through the single narrow window of the room that had been hers since the bonding ceremony. It was not the Alpha's chamber. It had never been the Alpha's chamber. Kyle had walked her to this room on the night of the ceremony, his face carved from something harder than stone, and said simply, "You'll sleep here." Then he had left. She had not asked why. She already knew why. The entire pack had watched the bonding ritual with the expression of people attending a funeral for someone they had never particularly liked. The boots were good boots, at least. Celine had 1 pair and she maintained them herself, resoling the left one twice already, with supplies she traded for from the pack's leatherworker, using the small monthly allowance that technically belonged to the Luna's position. Most of the allowance went toward things like that. Practical things. Things that kept her functional. She had learned to stop spending it on anything that might be interpreted as vanity, because vanity in a woman who couldn't shift was apparently a form of aggression. She pulled her dark hair back, tied it with a cord, and went downstairs. The great hall was already alive with the noise of 300 wolves eating breakfast. Long tables ran the length of the room, packed tight with warriors and their families, the sound of metal on stone and overlapping conversation hitting her the moment she pushed through the door. She felt the ripple move through the room the same way she always felt it. Not loudly, but persistently, like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned, gazes assessed. Some looked away quickly. Others held longer, mouths still moving, conversations continuing at lower volume. She walked to the far table and sat. A bowl of porridge was already there. Not because anyone had thought of her specifically. It was simply the overflow from the main serving station, set at the end of the table where the junior members and the pack's unmated young sat. She ate without speaking and watched the room from beneath lowered eyes the way she had learned to watch everything. Not passively, but carefully, storing everything, wasting nothing. Kyle sat at the head table on the raised platform at the far end of the hall. He was impossible not to notice, the way fire is impossible not to notice. The kind of presence that reorganizes the air around itself. He was laughing at something one of his senior warriors had said, his head thrown back, the sound genuine and full-bodied, and Celine felt the old familiar twist somewhere below her sternum that she had long since decided to call hunger rather than give it its real name. Raina Voss sat 2 seats from him on the raised platform. She had been elevated to the rank of senior counsel 4 months ago, a position that had not previously existed in the Shadowfang Pact structure, and that everyone understood meant exactly one thing. Raina was tall and copper-haired, and she moved through the pack house the way water moves through open country, like she owned the geography. She was laughing too, at the same joke, and when she laughed, she leaned slightly toward Kael with the easy familiarity of someone who no longer needed to calculate the distance. Celine ate her porridge. "Still here," said a voice beside her. She did not look up immediately. She finished the bite in her mouth, swallowed, then turned. Joran Vale. No relation, just a coincidence of names that had made her first weeks in the pack briefly amusing before it stopped being amusing, was 18 years old, newly initiated, and the kind of young man who had discovered that cruelty toward the right targets was a fast path to social standing among older warriors. He had a round face that would have been pleasant if it weren't always arranged in the expression he was wearing now, a smile that knew something. "I said still here," he repeated. "Figured you'd have run off by now, given the, He gestured vaguely in the direction of the head table. "Situation. Eat your food, Joran. My ma says an alpha can't truly lead if his mate's dragging him down. Says it's like a wolf trying to run with one leg broke." He tore off a piece of bread. "No offense." "None taken," Celine said, which was the safest answer, because it was the only answer. Anything else became an incident, and incidents became reports that reached Kael, and reports that reached Kael had a way of resolving in whatever direction made Celine's life smaller. Joran chewed. "Border's getting worse," he said, tone shifting, losing its needling edge in favor of something genuinely worried. "My brother did patrol last night. Says the Ashen scouts are moving closer. Not scouting anymore. Mapping." That made Celine look up fully. "How far in?" "Past the 3rd ridge marker, deep into the contested territory." Joran shrugged with the carelessness of someone who was afraid and performing the opposite. "Alpha'll handle it. That's what alphas are for." Celine said nothing. She finished her porridge and left the table. She spent the morning in the archive room on the packhouse's 3rd floor, which was the one place in the building where her presence was never questioned because nobody else voluntarily went there. The archive room smelled of old bark and dust and something faintly mineral that she had never been able to identify, and it held 30 years of the Shadowfang Pact's recorded history in a system that was loosely organized at best and impenetrable at worst. Celine had spent 2 of her 4 years here making quiet sense of it. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had noticed she was doing it. But she had, because it was something that needed doing, and because being useful in a way that nobody witnessed was still being useful. And she had decided sometime in her first year that she would rather be useful than be seen. The Ashen Empire occupied the southeastern territories beyond the Grey Wall Mountains, 3 mountain ranges and a river basin that the packs collectively referred to as the Contested Lands, because neither side had ever successfully held them. The Empire had pressed outward 3 times in the past decade, each time pulling back after sustained losses. What made the Empire dangerous was not its individual soldiers, it was its system. The Ashen military moved like a mechanism rather than like a pack, coordinated, patient, capable of sustaining campaigns that ran not weeks but seasons. Packs fought in bursts. The Empire did not. Celine spread the most recent territorial maps across the reading table and studied them. If the scouts were past the 3rd ridge marker, they were not mapping for a raid. Raiders needed roads and supply routes that favored speed. What the 3rd ridge position favored was logistics, the kind of positioning that preceded a sustained push. She marked the points on the map with a thin charcoal stick, connecting them slowly, feeling the shape of the thing emerge the way a figure emerges from stone when you know where to cut. "What are you doing?" She did not startle. She had heard him on the stairs. Kyle's footstep had a particular weight and rhythm that she had memorized without meaning to, the way you memorize the sound of weather coming before it arrives. She turned. Kale Draven was 31 years old, alpha of the Shadowfang Pack for the past 8 years, and built like something that had been designed specifically to make other things feel fragile in comparison. He was not the tallest alpha in the regional packs. But he carried height differently from men who simply possessed it. He used space the way a wolf uses space, with full intention, nothing wasted, every inch of presence accounted for. His eyes were a pale gray that turned almost silver in direct light, and they were fixed on the map spread across Celine's table with an expression she could not immediately read. "Research," she said. "I can see that." He moved into the room, and the room somehow rearranged itself around him without anything physically changing. He looked at the maps. He looked at her charcoal marks. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who told you about the ridge markers?" Joran Vale mentioned the patrol report at breakfast. Kyl's jaw tightened slightly. He shouldn't be talking about patrol intel in the Great Hall. He's 18 and frightened. Frightened people talk. She paused. "I've been tracking the Empire's movement patterns going back 6 years using the archive records. If you look at the position sequence," she indicated the marks. "They're not staging for a raid. This is pre-positioning for a siege line. They want the river crossing at Ash Point. Once they hold that, they control the entire contested basin's water supply for winter." Kyl was quiet. He studied the map. She watched his eyes move across it and knew, because she had watched him read tactical information many times from the back of strategy rooms where she was expected to sit silently, that he was competent. He understood what she was showing him. The tightness around his mouth confirmed it. "I'll bring this to the War Council," he said finally. "Of course." He turned to leave, then stopped, turned back. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, and the question had something in it that was almost genuine. An actual question rather than a rhetorical dismissal, which was rare enough that she registered it. "Because it's useful," she said, "and someone needed to." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes, and she looked back without flinching, because she had learned a long time ago that flinching cost more than it saved. Then he left. She stood alone in the archive room and listened to his steps descend the stairs. Then she folded the map carefully, noting her marks, and began compiling a written summary. The War Council met 3 days later, and she was not invited. She found out through the same method by which she found out most things. The packhouse walls were old and sound, carried through stone differently, depending on where you stood, and she had spent 4 years learning which walls carried what. She stood in the corridor outside the council chamber and listened to the muffled voices, and heard her own analysis presented back, heard it attributed to intelligence from our Eastern Patrol Network, heard the council's response, serious, engaged, the creak of chairs as men leaned forward over maps, and then heard the discussion move to solutions. "A peace mission," said a voice she recognized as Elder Torin, the pack's senior counselor, a man in his late 50s who smelled constantly of pine sap, and who had always been personally kind to Celine in the absent, slightly guilty way of someone who knows they are not doing enough. "The Empire has used diplomatic channels before. Lucian Thorn is brutal but not irrational. If we send an envoy with genuine territorial concessions attached, and if they take our envoy and use them as a hostage," said another voice, "then we send someone they can't leverage," Torrin's voice, "someone whose loss would not destabilize us." A silence. "Someone expendable," said Kyl. Another silence, longer. "The Luna," said Reyna Voss's voice, smooth and precise as a blade finding a clean angle. "She's technically the pack's representative under diplomatic protocol. Her position gives the mission legitimacy without risking an actual strategic asset, and if it goes wrong," a pause that managed to be elegant, "the pack survives the loss." Celine stood in the corridor with her back against the cold stone. She was aware of her own breathing. She was aware of the way her ribcage moved, in, out, the body's mindless insistence on continuing regardless of what the mind was processing. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall and felt the chill of it against her skin, real and absolute and indifferent. Inside the chamber, the conversation continued. She walked away before she heard Kyl's answer. She had already heard enough to know what it would be. That night she lay on her back in the narrow room and stared at the ceiling and thought clearly, not in the fractured, spiraling way of shock or grief, but in the flat, precise way she had trained herself to think when the situation required it. She was going to be sent on a diplomatic mission to the Ashen Empire. The mission might be genuine or it might be a setup. If it was genuine, she might survive it. If it was a setup, she might not. The pack had assessed her as expendable and reached a unanimous decision about her value. And that decision had been made in a room she wasn't allowed into, about her own life, by people who had never bothered to understand what she actually was. She thought about her wolf. The wolf pressed against her ribs in the dark. Not with distress, but with something that felt almost like patience, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment, like it had always known this moment would come and had simply been conserving itself for what came after. "Not yet," she whispered to the dark. The wolf was quiet. The formal summons came the next morning, delivered by one of Kael's junior officers with the wooden-faced neutrality of someone following orders they had decided not to think about. Celine was required to present herself to the Alpha's study at midday. She wore the same boots. She braided her hair this time, small and tight against her skull, the way she braided it when she wanted to stop thinking about it. She walked to Kael's study through corridors that watched her pass with the particular quality of silence that knows something the person walking through it does not officially know yet. Kael was standing at the window when she entered. Reina was there too, seated in the chair to the left of his desk, with her legs crossed and her hands folded, and her copper hair catching the light with the practiced ease of someone who had chosen exactly where to sit for maximum effect. Elder Torrens stood by the far wall with his hands clasped behind him and his eyes focused on a point slightly above Celine's head. "Celine," Kael said. He turned from the window. "We have a situation that requires your participation." "I'm aware of the nature of the mission," she said, a flicker behind his eyes. Brief. "Then you know why you're the appropriate choice." "I know why I've been designated the appropriate choice," she said. "I'm not sure they're the same thing." Reina made a small sound that could have been anything, dismissal, amusement, irritation, and shifted fractionally in her chair. "This is a genuine peace overture," Torrens said from the wall, and she heard in his voice the specific quality of a man trying to make something true by saying it carefully. "The Empire's diplomatic protocol requires a representative of full pack authority. Your position as Luna makes it legitimate," Celine said. "I understand." "The risk is real," Kael said, and she heard something in his voice that she parsed carefully, turning it over, looking for its shape. Not guilt, not quite. Something that sat adjacent to guilt, but had never fully committed to it. "We're not pretending otherwise." "What are my resources?" she asked. Silence. "Resources," she repeated. "I'll need a horse, provisions, a formal letter of authority bearing your seal, and an escort to the border crossing. Beyond the border, I'll be on my own. I want to know that I'm going with every legitimate tool your pack can provide within the constraints of the mission parameters." Kael looked at her for a moment. "You'll have them. A letter of authority bearing your seal," she said again. "Not a summary, not a recommendation. The full formal document with the Shadowfang seal and my designation as your authorized representative." Another pause. "Yes. Then I'll be ready in 2 days." She left the study before anyone could say anything else. She walked back to her room, closed the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to feel everything she was feeling. The cold weight of it, the particular quality of being considered disposable by someone whose face she still knew how to love even after everything, the old grief and the new clarity sitting together in her chest like two stones, neither canceling the other out. Then she stood up. She had 2 days to prepare, and she intended to use every hour of them. She went back to the archive room. She pulled everything the Shadowfang records held on the Ashen Empire. She had read most of it before, but she read it again now with different eyes. Not the eyes of a scholar cataloging history, but the eyes of a woman who needed to survive a specific situation. She read the Empire's diplomatic protocols, their territorial law, their documented treatment of foreign envoys. She read the accounts of previous Shadowfang delegations that had crossed into Ashen territory, 3 of them over 20 years. All 3 returned safely because the Empire had always, even at its most brutal, observed the formal protocols around declared diplomatic missions. She read about Lucian Thorn. The accounts were inconsistent in their details, but consistent in their overall portrait. A man who had inherited the imperial throne at 19 following the violent deaths of most of his immediate family, who had consolidated absolute control within 3 years through a combination of military force and strategic alliance, who was described alternately as cold-blooded and precise, ruthless and principled, A man who made promises rarely and honored them without exception, and who was reported to despise the kind of political maneuvering that substituted performance for substance. He was 34. He had never taken a consort. He was, by all accounts, the single most powerful individual between the mountains and the sea. She read about the empire's legal code governing visiting dignitaries. She memorized the phrases of formal greeting in the Ashen court language, practicing them quietly in the archive room until the syllables sat correctly in her mouth. She made a small written lexicon and folded it into the inside pocket of her traveling coat. She slept 4 hours both nights. She used the rest. On the morning of her departure, the packhouse courtyard was not empty. She had not expected ceremony. The Shadowfang Pack did not organize send-offs for missions it considered either minor or acceptable losses. But she had expected a certain amount of private indifference. What she found instead was an audience, perhaps 40 people, arranged along the courtyard walls with varying degrees of deliberateness, the kind of crowd that has assembled not to honor someone leaving, but to observe it, to register the fact of the departure the way people register the closing of a door that's been standing open too long. Her horse was ready. 2 junior warriors on their own horses were her escort to the border. Young men she recognized from her first year in the pack, neither hostile nor friendly, simply present. The horse was a gray mare, functional and sound and not particularly beautiful, which suited Celine fine. She loaded her own saddlebag. Nobody offered to help. She did not expect them to. Kyle was there. He stood at the courtyard entrance, not central, not ceremonial, off to the side with his hands in his coat pockets and his face arranged in the expression he wore for public moments that required him to be present without requiring him to feel anything in particular. Raina stood nearby, close enough to be a statement. Celine walked to her horse, checked the saddle girth once, and then turned. She looked at Kyle directly. Not with anger. She had made a decision about anger somewhere in the 2 sleepless nights behind her, had decided it was a cost she could not currently afford. She looked at him with the clear, leveled look of a woman who has completed an assessment and reached her final verdict. And what she put into that look was not hatred, but something colder, the absolute removal of all illusion. She was looking at him the way you look at terrain when you are done pretending it is anything other than what it is. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away first. She mounted her horse. "Safe travel," Elder Torin said from somewhere to her left, and his voice had in it the particular quality of a man who knows he is complicit in something and has chosen to say the smallest true thing available to him. "Thank you, Elder," Celine said. She rode out of the courtyard without looking back. The border crossing took 3 days through increasingly difficult terrain. The Grey Wall foothills were passable in early autumn, but not comfortable. The trails narrow and the weather coming down from the high country in gray sheets that turned the ground soft and made the horses work harder than they should have had to. Her escort said little. She said less. She used the hours of riding to practice the Ashen phrases she had memorized, murmuring them under her breath into the wind and the rain, and she used the nights, camped without fire in the contested lands, because fire was an invitation nobody wanted to issue, to lie on her back and feel her wolf in the way she had learned to feel it, not as an absence, not as a failure, but as a weight, a presence, something real. The wolf had been pressing outward more in the past 3 days than it had in months. She did not know what to make of that yet. At the border marker on the morning of the 4th day, her escort stopped. The younger of the 2, a man named Fen with a scar through his left eyebrow, cleared his throat. "This is as far as our orders take us," he said, and she heard in his voice that he was not proud of this fact. "I know," she said. "The Empire's first garrison checkpoint is 6 miles east," he said. "If you present the Alpha's letter there, they'll take you under formal diplomatic protocol. You'll be safe." A pause. "Probably." She looked at him. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Thank you for the escort," she said. She rode east alone. The garrison checkpoint was where Fen had said it would be. She presented herself and Kael's letter to the Ashen officer on duty, a lean, careful-eyed woman of perhaps 40, who read the letter twice and then looked at Celine with the particular expression of someone doing rapid calculations about the political implications of the thing in front of them. "Luna of the Shadowfang Pack," the officer said, "traveling alone." "My pack felt a smaller delegation would signal more sincere intent," Celine said, which was the most tactful available framing of the reality. The officer considered this. Then she called for an escort. Celine was taken deeper into Empire territory through ordered roads and disciplined checkpoints, each one more complex than the last. And she paid attention to everything: the troop disposition, the supply lines, the quality of the horses, the way the soldiers moved, the relationships between ranks. She was storing it, all of it, the way she stored everything, because information had been the only currency she'd had access to for 4 years, and the habit of accumulating it was too deeply built now to switch off. They traveled 2 more days. The landscape shifted from the raw, contested hills to something more structured. The Empire's interior was organized differently from pack territory, more deliberately, roads wider and better maintained, settlements placed with clear logistical intention rather than the organic sprawl of pack communities. It was not more beautiful, it was more purposeful. There was something about that purposefulness that Celine, who had spent years in a place that had never been built with her in mind, found unexpectedly calming. On the evening of the second day of Empire travel, something changed. The escort that had been moving efficiently and without particular urgency suddenly became very quiet. The lead rider spoke briefly and quickly to the others. The formation tightened around her horse, not threateningly. She registered the distinction carefully, but protectively, the way bodies move around something that has been identified as valuable or fragile or both. "What's happening?" she asked. "There are wolves in this section," said the lead rider, a young man with a close-cropped beard who had been consistently professional and had told her his name was Davin. His voice was even, but his eyes were tracking the tree line. "Not your pack's wolves, unaffiliated. We think—" He hesitated. The first arrow came from the left and took Davin in the shoulder. The world went loud and fast. Celine had trained her whole life for a wolf's reflexes without ever being able to fully access them, but 4 years in a hostile pack had given her human reflexes that weren't much slower. She was off the horse before the second arrow flew, rolling into the tree line on the opposite side from the attack, the sounds of fighting erupting immediately behind her, metal, shouts, the heavy concussive sounds of bodies and animals in close combat. She hit the ground running, made 20 meters into the trees, and stopped behind a rock formation with her back to stone and her ears working. The fight was short. The escort was disciplined and well-trained, and the attackers, she counted at least 6 by sound, possibly more, had relied on the ambush advantage and lost it the moment the Ashen soldiers stopped being surprised. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then silence, except for the sounds of wounded being attended to and orders being given at clipped volume. Celine stood up from behind the rock. She stepped back toward the road. A hand came from nowhere and caught her arm, and the voice that spoke was not one of the escorts. It was the wrong accent, too rough, too deliberate. "Luna Celine, don't scream. I'm from the pack." She turned. The man was perhaps 30, heavy-built, dressed in hunting clothes that were better suited to pack territory than to Empire roads. His face was broad and unfamiliar, but the scar pattern on his forearm, she had catalogued those in the pack records too, the warrior markings, was Shadowfang. "What are you doing here?" she said, keeping her voice level. "The Alpha sent me ahead," the man said. "There's been a development. The peace mission is compromised." His hand was still on her arm. She registered this. "You need to come with me now. I'll take you back." "Release my arm," she said. He did not. "There isn't time," he said, and the quality of his voice had changed, the urgent, helpful overlay thinning over something else underneath. "We need to move before the Empire soldiers—" "Who sent you?" she said. Not a question. A demand. The man's eyes shifted for a fraction of a second. That fraction told her everything. She moved. She had spent 4 years watching warriors train from the edges of practice grounds, and she had spent those 4 years memorizing every technique, every leverage point, every principle, practicing in her own room in the small hours with nothing but the floor and her own weight and the animal patience of someone who cannot afford to be caught preparing. She was not a warrior, but she was not nothing either. She broke his grip at the wrist's weak point, stepped inside his reach before he could recalibrate, and drove her elbow into the soft junction between his jaw and his neck. Not hard enough to do lasting damage, but hard enough to interrupt his ability to speak or grab for exactly the 4 seconds she needed. She ran. She did not run back toward the road and the Ashen escort. She ran deeper into the trees, because the escort was an unknown variable, and the man from her own pack was a known threat, and she had made a decision in the fraction of a second before she moved. If the mission was compromised, if she had been sent here not to negotiate but to be removed, then returning to Shadowfang territory meant returning to the disposal mechanism, and her wolf was pressing harder against her ribs than it ever had. And she was running, and she was not stopping, and the trees were dark, and the footing was uncertain, and behind her she could hear him crashing after her, and ahead of her there was nothing but Empire territory and the unknown. She ran for a long time. The terrain was brutal in the dark. Roots, loose stone, a slope that turned suddenly steep and had her skidding and catching herself on bark, and then climbing rather than running, hands and feet on cold rock, the burn of effort in her lungs raw and immediate and real. She did not stop. She did not call out. She did not look back more than once. Once, to confirm he was no longer close enough to be immediately dangerous, which told her either she had extended her lead or she had taken a direction he hadn't anticipated. And then she kept moving. She ran until she couldn't hear anything behind her. She stopped when she reached a ridge overlooking a valley, breathing in hard, ragged pulls, hands on her knees, her body's resources in full inventory mode, bruised palm where she'd caught a root wrong, twisted left ankle that was complaining but not disabling. No serious damage, cold sweat drying on her skin in the autumn night air. She looked at the valley below. Lights. Not campfire lights. These were the precise, organized lights of a permanent installation. A large one. Her mind, still running its calculations even through the noise of exertion and adrenaline, supplied the answer before she consciously formed the question. She had read the maps. She had memorized the Empire's territorial layout as thoroughly as she'd memorized everything else. She was looking at the Ashen Empire's third garrison fortress, which meant she was deep inside Empire territory, alone, without escort, following a compromised mission from an alpha who had already demonstrated what he believed she was worth. Her wolf pressed outward with something that was almost urgency. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, breathed, steadied. She began to pick her way down into the valley. She had not eaten since morning. Her ankle was swelling inside the boot. The letter of authority bearing Kael's seal was in her inside pocket, still intact, and she thought with a clarity that surprised even herself. This letter does not represent the pack anymore. It represents me. It represents the fact that I was here, in this place, at this moment, doing this. She was perhaps 200 meters down the slope when the torchlight found her. 4 soldiers materialized from the trees to her left and right, with the precision of people who had been watching the ridge for exactly this kind of development, and the torchlight hit her face, and she stopped and raised both hands slowly and kept her breathing controlled, and her face as neutral as she could hold it. "I am Celine Vale," she said, in the Ashen Court language she had practiced in a rain-soaked archive room 2 days and a lifetime ago, her pronunciation careful and deliberate, and as clean as 4 hours of practice could make it. "Luna of the Shadowfang Pack, authorized representative under formal diplomatic protocol, carrying letters of authority under my Alpha's seal. I am requesting an audience under the terms of the Empire's own diplomatic charter." The soldiers looked at her, looked at each other. The tallest one, older, some kind of officer rank indicated by the banding on his armor, studied her face for a long moment. Then he looked at her hands, at the traveling clothes, at the state of her. Muddy, winded, alone on a dark ridge inside Imperial territory. "Luna of the Shadowfang Pack," he repeated slowly. "Yes." "Traveling alone." There were complications. Another silence. "You'll come with us," he said, and it was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I will." They took her to the fortress. They took the letter of authority from her inside pocket and disappeared with it. She was placed in a room that was not a cell. It had a chair and a lamp and water in a basin, and the door was not locked, which she tested carefully approximately 30 seconds after being left alone. But it was not a guest chamber either. It was something in between, a holding space designed for situations without clear category. She washed her face in the basin. She sat in the chair. She thought. Kael had sent a man after her, not to escort her, not to protect her. The mission was a disposal mechanism. She had known this in the corridor outside the council chamber, had known it with her body even before she knew it with her mind, and she had gone anyway, because going gave her the letter, and the letter gave her something to stand on, and standing on something, anything, was better than standing on nothing. She was inside the Ashen Empire with a compromised mission, a letter from an alpha who had tried to have her removed and no pack standing behind her. She was, by most operational definitions, exactly as alone as she had always been. Her wolf pressed against her ribs once, twice. She pressed back. "Not yet," she said again, to the small room, to the lamplight, to whatever it was that had been waiting inside her all this time for the right moment to finally stop waiting. The door opened. Not the officer, not a soldier. The man who stepped through the doorway was tall, taller than she had expected from the accounts, which had described height but not quite this specific quality of presence, with dark hair cropped close, gray eyes that were not Kael's silver, but something older and harder than silver, a face that had been carved by decision rather than just by years. And he wore no crown or formal insignia, nothing that should have told her immediately who he was, except that every single thing about how he occupied the doorway made it entirely clear. He looked at her. She looked back. He said nothing for a long moment, and then his eyes moved to the base of her throat, to the place where her collar had been displaced by the run through the trees and by the basin washing, the place where the old seal mark sat against her skin, the mark she had carried since birth, the mark she had always been told was a minor bloodline notation of no particular significance. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "Who are you?" he said, and his voice was exactly what the accounts had suggested. Precise, without heat, the voice of a man who asks questions to which he already suspects the answer and wants to see whether the answer you give matches the one he already holds. "I told your soldiers," she said. "I am Celine Vale, Luna of the Shadow Fang." "That is your title," he said. "I did not ask your title." The room was very still. Outside, she could hear the fortress running its nighttime operations. Boots on stone, the distant call of a watch change, the structural sounds of a large establishment that never fully sleeps. And here there was only the lamp and the chair and this man in the doorway with his impossible eyes fixed on the mark on her skin. "I don't know what you think you're seeing," she said carefully. "I think," said Emperor Lucian Thorn, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him, "that you do." She had been sent here to disappear. Instead, she was standing in a room alone with the most powerful man on the continent, and he was looking at her throat like he had spent years looking for exactly what was written there. And the wolf inside her ribs was no longer pressing outward. It was pushing. The lamp between them did not flicker. There was no draft in the room, no reason for the light to move, and yet Celine was aware of it the way she was aware of everything in the room, the lamp, the basin, the distance between her chair and the door, the distance between herself and the man who had just closed that door, as a set of variables whose arrangement mattered. Lucian Thorn had not moved since closing the door. He stood with his back against it, not blocking it deliberately, but occupying the space in front of it naturally, the way a man stands in front of something when it has not yet occurred to him that anyone would need to use it. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at her throat. She did not cover the mark. Covering it would tell him something. Covering it would confirm that she knew it was significant, which would confirm that she had been lying when she implied she didn't. And she had decided in the instant before she said those words that lying directly to this specific man was a cost she couldn't calculate yet, and therefore shouldn't spend. "Your soldiers have my letter," she said. "The formal one. Kael Draven's seal." "I know." "Then you know I'm here under diplomatic—" "I read the letter 20 minutes ago," Lucian said. "The letter isn't why I'm here." He pushed off from the door. He moved across the room without hurry, the way a man moves when he has already decided on the destination, and the only variable is pace, and he stopped 3 feet from her chair and looked down at the mark with the focused quality of someone doing final confirmation rather than initial assessment. "Stand up," he said. She stood, not because he told her to, because sitting while he stood was a positional disadvantage she didn't need. He was close enough that she could have reached him if she'd wanted to, and close enough that she registered, with the irritating precision of a body that still processed certain information, regardless of whether the mind considered it useful, that he was warmer than the room, and that the gray of his eyes up close had more complexity in it than the accounts had captured, and that he smelled of cold iron and something faintly resinous, like woods in early winter. She met his eyes directly and held. "The mark on your skin," he said. "Do you know what it is?" I was told it was a minor bloodline notation. Who told you that? The people who raised me. Something moved behind his eyes. And where are those people now? Dead, she said, when I was 7. A silence. It had weight to it, not the empty weight of a pause, but the dense weight of a man reorganizing a significant quantity of information against a framework he had been carrying for a long time. The mark is the seal of the Ashen Imperial line, Lucian said. It has not appeared on a living person in 17 years. The last person who carried it was an infant girl who was taken from this empire during the border raids before the last war. She would be 23 now. Celine said nothing. You are 23, he said. A lot of people are 23. Not carrying that mark. The lamp between them burned steadily. She could hear her own heartbeat. Not loud, not panicked, just present, the body's reliable percussion running underneath everything else, keeping time. I don't know what you want me to say, she said. I want you to tell me if you knew. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she looked at things when she was deciding how much of the truth to spend. He was watching her with the same quality of attention she had noticed when he walked in. Precise, without the social overlay most people kept running over their real expressions, reading her the way she read maps, looking for the shape of the thing underneath the presented surface. No, she said. I did not know. He held her gaze. Whatever he was looking for, he found it, or didn't find the thing he was checking for because, after a moment, he stepped back and some of the pressure in the room changed. Sit down, he said, and this time there was something fractionally different in his voice. Not softness, nothing like softness, but a recalibration of urgency. She sat. He remained standing, but differently, less positioned, more thinking. He turned away from her and looked at the wall, and she watched the set of his shoulders and thought, he is deciding how much of the truth to spend on me, too. Your pack sent you here to die, he said, his back still partly toward her. That's a strong characterization. Is it inaccurate? She did not answer. The man who followed you from the border, Lucian said. We picked him up 3 miles east of where you separated. He is currently being asked questions. A pause. He is answering them. Celine absorbed this. What is he saying? Lucian turned. That the alpha of the Shadow Fang pack did not send him to escort you home. The room was very quiet. Then who? She said. That, said Lucian, is what he is still being asked. He moved to the chair on the opposite side of the lamp and sat in it, not leaning forward, not performing ease, just sitting with the economic physicality of someone who doesn't arrange themselves for an audience. He looked at her with those complicated gray eyes, and she thought about all the accounts she had read of him and wondered which ones had been written by people who had sat this close. You speak Ashen, he said. Not fluently, but you prepared. I was given 2 days' notice. Most pack representatives arrive with translators and no preparation. You came alone and memorized the greeting protocols. He was quiet for a moment. Why? Because I was going to need every advantage I could carry. Because you knew the mission was compromised. I knew the mission was a risk. You knew, he said again, flat, not aggressive, simply insisting on accuracy. You knew and you came anyway. She held the eye contact. There was no version of staying that was better than the version of going. Something in his face changed by a very small amount. Not warmth, nothing she would call warmth, but a species of recognition, the way one specific kind of intelligence recognizes another across a distance. The letter you carried, he said. Shadowfang Diplomatic Authority. If you are who I believe you are, he stopped. Began again. There are individuals in this empire who have been looking for the missing heir for 17 years. Some of them because they believe the imperial bloodline carries obligations. Others because a living heir is a political asset they would prefer to control before anyone else does. And which category are you? She asked. His eyes didn't move. Neither. Then what category are you? The category, he said, of someone who does not like unresolved variables. She looked at him. I'm a person, not a variable. Yes, he said, without any indication of apology. You are. And in my experience, people are the most complicated variables there are. He stood. You'll stay in this fortress tonight. Tomorrow I'll have the mark verified formally by the Imperial Recorder. If it confirms what I believe it confirms, we will have a conversation about what comes next. And if I don't agree to the verification?" He stopped, looked at her. "You rode 6 days through contested territory, survived an assassination attempt, and walked into an Imperial fortress alone at night," he said. "You are not a woman who refuses information about herself." He was right. She hated that he was right, or not hated it exactly. She didn't have the resources for hate right now. But she registered it, filed it, noted the category of man who could read that accurately that fast. "What comes next?" she said. "What does that mean?" "It means your pack betrayed you. You are without allies. And I have information about your origins that changes the legal landscape of this entire region's territorial claim structure." He moved toward the door. "It means we have things to discuss." He opened the door. "Lucian," she said. He stopped. The use of his name without title landed differently in the air between them. Not disrespectfully, but as a choice, and he registered it as a choice. She could see that in the half-turn of his head. "If the verification confirms it," she said, "if I am what you think I am, what happens to the Shadowfang pack?" He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you decide to do with the information. And you'll let me decide." "I will let you decide," he said, "after you understand what all the options cost." Then he left. The door did not lock. She had already known it wouldn't. She sat in the chair for a long time after he left, and let everything she had been carrying through 6 days of travel and 1 night of running expand to its actual size now that she was alone with it. The isolation of it, the particular quality of being completely without ground to stand on, no pack, no title that meant anything, no person in any direction whose interest in her survival was genuine rather than instrumental. She had spent 4 years as a woman whose continued presence was merely tolerated. She had imagined that could not get lonelier. She had been wrong. But underneath that, she searched for it deliberately, pressing past the cold and the fatigue and the swollen ankle and the fact that she had eaten nothing since morning. Underneath it all, her wolf was not distressed. Her wolf was the steadiest it had ever been, like it had been waiting for the floor to disappear, like it had always known the floor was temporary and had been conserving itself for the moment she finally learned that too. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum. The wolf pressed back. The verification took place the following morning in a stone chamber 3 floors up in the fortress, where the light came through narrow windows and bars, and an elderly man with stained fingers and careful eyes examined the mark on her skin with instruments she didn't recognize for approximately 20 minutes without speaking. Lucian stood in the corner of the room and watched. 2 guards flanked the door. No one explained the instruments to her, or asked her how she was doing, or offered anything resembling the social consideration you extend to a person. You are not in the process of assessing like a document whose provenance is disputed. She held still. She breathed. She watched the old man's face for the information his control was leaking and found it in the slight tremor of his hands, somewhere around the 12-minute mark. Not the tremor of age, she had watched enough aged hands to know the difference, but the tremor of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and is having the particular physical experience of finding it. "Well," he said, to Lucian, not to her. "Say it," Lucian said. "It's genuine." The old man straightened. His voice was steady and his hands were not. "The secondary verification pattern is present under the primary seal. I would need the formal records to provide official documentation, but—" he paused. "This is the mark. There is no other version of this mark. This is the lost heir of the Ashen Imperial line." The room was very quiet. Celine sat with it. With the specific quality of learning something that rearranges your entire past without changing a single event in it. Every fact about her life sitting exactly where it had always sat, except now all of them meant different things. The dead family who had told her the mark was minor. The sealed wolf that had never fully manifested. The 4 years of careful isolation in a pack that had been inexplicably reluctant to let her leave and inexplicably contemptuous of everything she was. The man she had called her mate, who had spent 4 years managing her toward smallness. Her wolf pushed against her ribs once, hard, with the specific quality of something that has been caged long enough to understand exactly what the cage was made of. She looked at Lucian. He was looking back at her with an expression that was still controlled but had something behind it now, Not pity, she could not have tolerated pity. Something else, something that acknowledged the weight of what the old man had just said without pretending it wasn't heavy. I want the room, she said. The old man glanced at Lucian. Lucian nodded once. The old man left. The guards shifted. Them too, she said. Lucian looked at her for a moment, then, outside. The guards left. She and Lucian were alone in the stone room with the bar light coming through the narrow windows. Talk, she said. What do you want to know? Everything. So he told her. He told it the way he did everything. Without embellishment, without softening, in the flat, precise register of a man who has decided information is more respectful than comfort. The border raids 17 years ago. The political crisis that had followed the disappearance of the imperial child. The way the missing heir had become both a wound and a political instrument. Proof of imperial vulnerability for those who wanted to challenge Lucian's consolidation. A theoretical trump card for anyone who found her first. The 17 years of looking. The agents across the pack territories who had been tasked with identifying the mark on any woman of the right age. Your pack, he said. The Shadow Fang. They knew. She had known he was going to say this. She had known it since the corridor outside the council chamber, had known it in the way you know things that are too large to think about directly. In your peripheral vision, in the pressure behind your sternum, in the specific quality of being managed by someone who knows more about you than you know about yourself. But hearing it said out loud in this room, in this voice, was different from knowing it. The Alpha knew, she said. Not a question. K.L. Draven's father accepted payment 17 years ago to take in a child and ensure she never became aware of her bloodline, to keep her sealed. Lucian's voice was even throughout. The sealing of your wolf was deliberate. Someone with access to imperial bloodline sorcery performed it when you were an infant. The question of who ordered it is still, he killed my family, she said. My real family. Lucian was quiet. The family I was with when I was 7. They died. She heard her own voice from a slight distance, the way you hear yourself when the thing you are saying has not yet connected all the way to the part of you that feels it. He killed them because they were starting to figure it out. We believe so. And then he brought me into the pack, bonded me to his son, kept me small enough that I would never... She stopped, kept her small enough that she would never become what she was. She sat with that for exactly as long as it took to understand its full shape. Then she set it down somewhere inside herself in the place where she put things that were too heavy to carry while also moving forward, the place where she had been putting heavy things for years, the place that was, she now understood, considerably fuller than she had acknowledged. Your wolf, Lucian said. The ceiling should have deteriorated with distance from the pack. The farther you travel from whoever maintains it, it's been pressing outward for 3 days, she said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. It will continue. The full manifestation will be... He paused. I'm told it is not a gentle process for someone who has been sealed since infancy. I don't need it to be gentle. Something moved across his face, brief, specific, gone, before she could categorize it cleanly. He looked at her in the bar light from the narrow windows, and she looked back, and there was a moment in the room that had a different texture from the moments that had preceded it. Not softer, nothing softer, but with a different quality of attention on both sides. Two people who had each spent considerable time being alone in rooms with difficult truths they were not supposed to understand. What do you want? He asked. Not as a diplomat, as a direct question. She thought about what she wanted. She thought about the pack house and the narrow room and the porridge at the servants' table, and Kael's eyes sliding off her face for 6 weeks. She thought about 4 years of being the woman everyone had decided was exactly as small as they needed her to be. She thought about the wolf that had been pressing against her ribs since she crossed into the contested lands, patient as stone, waiting. I want my wolf, she said. I want to understand what I am, and then... She stopped. And then, Lucian said, and then I want to go home, she said, and I want to not be the same thing I was when I left. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the fortress, she could hear the operations of the day beginning. The organized sound of a large military installation running its routines. The sound of something that worked because it was built well and maintained with intention. I can offer you protection, he said. Resources. The truth about your bloodline and what it means legally within the Empire's territorial authority. Training, if you want it." He paused. "And I can offer you time, as much as you need to decide what you do with it." "Why?" she asked. "You said you weren't looking for an asset to control." "I'm not." "Then why offer any of this?" He was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than hesitant. The difference between a man choosing what to say and a man uncertain what to say. "Because," he said, "what was done to you was done against the laws of this empire and against a child who had no part in any of it, and I do not—" He stopped. "I do not leave things like that unaddressed." She looked at him. "That's the principled answer," she said. "What's the real one?" His eyes didn't move. "That is the real one," he said. "Not the only one, but real." She thought about that. She thought about the quality of the silence when he had looked at her mark. Not hungry, not calculating, but something older than either of those things. Recognition, possibly. The specific quality of a man who has been holding a responsibility for a very long time, finally having a direction in which to aim it. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "I'll stay, for now." She held his gaze. "But I make my own decisions. About everything. I don't trade one handler for another." He looked at her for a moment with those winter-gray eyes, and something in his face settled into a line that she would later understand was the expression he wore when he had reached a conclusion he intended to keep. "No," he said, "you don't." The first time her wolf came forward, it was 3 weeks later, in the training yard at the hour before dawn when the sky was the particular gray of a held breath. She had been working with one of Lucian's senior trainers, a woman named Cor, who was compact and matter-of-fact and had the eyes of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything but could still be interested. And the session had been pushing her through the physical baseline work that preceded any attempt at the shift, the kind of deliberate, sustained effort that brought the body's systems to the specific threshold where the wolf could press through the remaining seal without resistance. She had been doing this work every day. Each day the seal was thinner. Each day the wolf was closer to the surface. That morning, in the cold pre-dawn, with her hands on the training ground earth and sweat cooling on her back, and every muscle in her body working at full capacity, the seal came apart. It did not happen the way she had imagined it would. Not as a dramatic rupture, not with light or sound, not with anything that could be narrated cleanly. It happened like the last fiber of a rope that has been fraying for weeks. The exact moment of release, almost quiet, almost private. And then the full weight of the thing that had been held by that rope arriving all at once. The wolf came through and the world went white. She was aware of Cor stepping back sharply. She was aware of the earth under her changing texture as her hands and knees became something else. The specific quality of contact between paw and ground enormously more complex and immediate than she could have predicted from theory. She was aware of her own breathing restructuring itself, the mechanics of her lungs shifting, and she was aware of a sound she was making that was not a sound she had ever made before, low and from somewhere deep and structural. And she was aware of Lucian. He was at the edge of the training yard. She did not know how long he had been there. He stood with his arms at his sides, and he was looking at her. Not alarmed, not performing calm, just watching with those complicated gray eyes, and what was in them was attention of the precise, undistracted kind. The kind that does not flinch from what it is looking at. She held the shift for 47 seconds by the count she kept in the part of her mind that was still running its calculations even through this, even now. Then she came back, and the coming back hurt in ways she had not prepared for, the body's protest at the reversal of everything it had just done. And she was on her hands and knees on the training ground, earth breathing in shaking pulls, and there was blood on her lower lip from where she had bitten it on the way through. Cor crouched beside her. "First time's always brutal," she said, with the flat, practical sympathy of someone who is not going to pretend otherwise. "Drink something, then we do it again." Celine looked up. Lucian was still at the edge of the yard. He had not moved. She met his eyes across the training ground. This woman who 3 weeks ago had been sent to die by her own pack, kneeling in the dirt of an enemy empire, bleeding from her own mouth. Her wolf finally arrived and burning under her skin like something that had always been there and had simply, finally, been given permission to exist. She held his gaze, then she pushed herself to her feet. "Again," she said to Cor, Over the weeks that followed, two things happened simultaneously, and she was aware of both of them with the same careful precision she brought to everything she had ever needed to survive. The first was her transformation, the wolf growing stronger with each session, her body relearning its own architecture, the sealed abilities coming through one by one like light through incrementally widened gaps. The speed first, then the heightened senses. Then the shadow manipulation that the Imperial records identified as specific to her bloodline. The ability to move between lit and unlit spaces with a fluidity that was not quite teleportation, but was not quite conventional movement either. Core trained her body. The Imperial archivist trained her bloodline theory. And Lucian argued with her, not in the way that Kael had managed her, not with the particular cruelty of a person who had decided you were beneath serious engagement and was making that decision visible. He argued with her the way someone argues when they expect you to push back, directly, without softening, making his case and waiting for hers. About strategy. About the pact territories and the political landscape and what the Empire's position should be. About what she was going to do when she was ready. She pushed back every time. He never looked anything other than interested when she did. She noticed this. She filed it. She had not decided what to do with it yet. The morning the Imperial courier arrived with the report from Shadowfang territory, she was in the archive room, not the fortress archive, larger and better organized than the pack houses, and she had felt the particular pleasure of a good archive the first time she walked into it, had almost laughed at herself for feeling that way while her life was arranged as it currently was. And Lucian came to find her rather than sending someone, which he did when the information was the kind he preferred to deliver in person. The Shadowfang pack, he said from the doorway, is preparing for an alliance ceremony. The major packs in the region are gathering at the Shadowfang compound in 6 weeks. Kael Draven is presenting it as a unified territorial agreement, a defense posture against the Empire. He paused. Against us. She set down the document she was holding. 6 weeks, she said. You have been here 3 months, he said. Your wolf is fully manifested. Your shadow ability is functional. Your knowledge of the bloodline law is... He paused again. Complete. You have read everything we have. She looked at him. You're asking whether I'm ready, she said. I'm noting, he said, that a window exists. She stood with that for a moment. She thought about the pack house, the narrow room, the porridge at the servants' table. She thought about Kael's face when she had looked at him for the last time in the courtyard, the moment before she rode out. The way he had looked away first, which she understood now was not shame but management, the practiced eye slide of a man doing threat assessment and concluding she was not one. She thought about walking back through those doors, not as what she had been. If I go back, she said, I go back as what I am now, with full Imperial authority behind the visit, formal delegation, your seal alongside mine. Yes, and the evidence about Kael's arrangement with your predecessor, everything that proves what was done. Yes, this is not a rescue mission, she said. I am not going back for them. I am going back because what was taken from me has a rightful place, and that place is not in Kael Draven's desk where he keeps things he has stolen. Lucian looked at her from the doorway with those gray eyes and that face that had been shaped by decision, and she held his gaze the way she had learned to hold everything, without flinching, without the social overlay, just directly. No, he said. It isn't. Then we plan it, she said. Then we plan it, he agreed. She turned back to the maps on the table and spread them out. The same hand that had spread maps in a dusty archive room 4 months ago, but different now in ways that mattered, steadier, with something behind it that had been sealed since infancy and was now fully, irreversibly awake. Outside the archive window, the Empire ran its organized routines. Inside the room, Celine Vale, Luna of the Shadowfang Pack, heir of the Ashen Imperial line, woman who had been sent to die and had chosen not to, began to plan the shape of her return. And 6 weeks away in the great hall of a pack house she had eaten breakfast alone in for 4 years, a celebration was being organized by a man who believed she was dead. He was going to find out exactly how wrong he was. The question was not whether she would walk back through those doors. The question was whether anything in that room would still be standing when she was done. The plan had the clean, load-bearing quality of something built by two people who did not waste words. 6 weeks. That was the window. The Shadowfang Alliance ceremony was set for the last day of the month, and they had spent those weeks the way Celine spent everything she was given. Completely, without waste, without the luxury of using any of it on things that didn't matter. The Imperial delegation would arrive at the Shadowfang compound on the morning of the ceremony under formal diplomatic flag, announced in advance through the proper channels so there could be no claim of hostile intrusion. The letter of intent had gone out 3 weeks prior, bearing both the Imperial seal and Celine's own designation as the Ashen Heir, which had the effect of a stone dropped into still water, the ripple of it reaching Shadowfang territory and everything around it before they did. Kael's response had been silence, which was its own answer. She knew silence now. She had spent 4 years submerged in the Shadowfang Pack's particular brand of it. The silence that was not absence of communication, but a form of it, deliberate and pressurized. The silence of people who have decided that acknowledging you fully would give you a standing you are not supposed to have. Kael's silence in response to the Imperial letter was the same thing scaled up, the Alpha's version. A refusal to legitimize the thing he didn't want to be real by responding to it as though it were. He was going to have to respond to it in person. The night before departure, she stood in the training yard alone in the dark, her wolf moving through the shadow shift, with the ease of something that had been doing this for years rather than 3 months, moving between the torchlit sections and the dark ones, the way water moves between stones, not around them, but through the spaces between, reappearing 6 feet from where she had been without any visible transition. It still cost her something. It was not effortless. But the cost was measurable now, and she could budget it, which was all she needed. She heard him before she saw him. Lucian came to the edge of the training yard the way he always came, without announcing himself, without the social preamble most people used to cushion their arrival, just present where he had not been a moment before. She had stopped finding it startling around week 4. Now she registered it the way she registered the sounds of the fortress, as information, noted and filed. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." He was quiet. She finished the shadow shift sequence she had been running and came to rest at the center of the yard, her breathing elevated but controlled, and looked at him. "Say what you came to say," she said. He was quiet for another moment. In the months she had been here, she had learned the different qualities of his silences. This one was not the silence of a man choosing his words, but the silence of a man who had chosen them and was deciding whether to spend them. "Once we are in Shadowfang territory," he said, "the diplomatic protocols constrain what I can do unilaterally. If the situation deteriorates, the situation will deteriorate," she said. "That is the plan. Controlled deterioration is the whole point. If it deteriorates beyond the controlled parameters," she looked at him steadily, "then I handle it." Celine. The way he said her name had changed somewhere in the past 3 months, and she had noticed this and placed it in the same category as other things she had noticed and not yet decided what to do with. Not filed under threat, not filed under irrelevant, sitting in an unlabeled category she was leaving alone for now because they had a ceremony to attend in the morning, and everything that existed outside the operational frame of the next 48 hours was a cost she couldn't currently afford. "I know what I'm walking back into," she said. "I have known since the corridor outside the council chamber. I have had 6 months to understand it completely." She paused. "You gave me that time, and everything you gave me I used. You know that." He looked at her in the torchlight with those winter-gray eyes. "Yes," he said, "I know that." "Then trust what it made." Another silence, different quality. The density of a man who has decided something and is living inside that decision. "The escort is ready at dawn," he said. Then he left. She stood in the dark yard alone and pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt the wolf, steady as stone, waiting. "Almost," she said. The wolf did not respond. It didn't need to. The Shadowfang compound had not changed. She had known it wouldn't. 3 months was not long enough to change stone, but some part of her had expected it to look different, the way places from your past look smaller when you return to them. It did not look smaller. The black stone walls and the silver banners and the smell of wood smoke and wet fur hit her as the delegation crested the last ridge, and the compound spread below them in the cold morning light, and her body responded before her mind could moderate it. Recognition, full body, the particular animal weight of a place that had been home in the most ambivalent possible sense of that word. 40 riders. Full imperial formal regalia, not military colors, but the state delegation variant, which said diplomacy rather than invasion, which was deliberate. Lucian rode at the front beside her, which was also deliberate. The black imperial standard and Celine's own new designation banner, the heir's mark in silver on black, flown for the first time, moved above them in the autumn wind. She was wearing the imperial traveling coat. She was wearing the crown, not a full coronation crown. The traveling crown, compact and deliberate, black iron worked into the shape of interlocking wolf heads and shadow thorns. The heir's crown that had been locked in the imperial vault for 17 years, waiting for the person it belonged to. The imperial archivist had placed it on her head 3 days ago with the particular solemnity of someone completing a task that had been deferred for a very long time. It sat above her braided hair with the weight of something that had always been hers. They rode through the compound gates. She had thought about this moment. She had run it in her mind many times over the past weeks, the way she ran tactical scenarios, examining it from multiple angles, testing it for failure points, adjusting. But there was no scenario she had built that fully captured what it was to actually ride through these gates on this horse in this coat wearing this crown, with 40 imperial riders at her back, and the compound's population lining the approach road in stunned, total silence. She looked straight ahead. The Great Hall had been prepared for the alliance ceremony. All the pack leaders from the regional territories gathered inside. Kael's allies and his counselors and his warriors and the senior members of 6 packs who had ridden in to witness the Shadowfang Pack's formal ascendancy over the regional alliance. The doors were open. She could see light and warmth inside. She rode to the entrance, dismounted, handed the reins to one of the imperial riders without looking, walked through the doors. The great hall went quiet before she was fully inside. Not the gradual hush of a crowd that becomes aware of something incrementally, but the sudden, complete silence of 200 people who have been hit simultaneously by the same information. She counted it as she crossed the threshold. 2 seconds, 3, the sound of the room shutting off like a door closing on wind, and then nothing but the fire in the hearths and the sound of her own boots on the stone floor, and behind her the measured footsteps of Lucian and the first 6 riders of the imperial escort. Kael was at the head table. He was standing, had been standing mid-speech when the doors opened. She caught the tail of the moment, his hands on the table in the posture of a man making a point. And now he was frozen in that posture, his pale gray eyes on her face, and she watched something move through him that took exactly 4 seconds to fully complete its journey from the front of his expression to whatever was behind it. "Celine," he said, and his voice had nothing in it. He had stripped it entirely. "Kael," she said. She kept walking. She walked to the center of the hall and stopped and looked at him across the space and let the room hold what the room was holding. The particular quality of a silence that 200 people are all participating in simultaneously, not one of them willing to be the first to break it. Reyna Voss was at the head table. She was very still. Elder Torin was at the far wall. She saw him and their eyes met briefly, and in his face she saw the specific expression of a man who had known something was wrong for years, and had chosen to know it quietly, and who was now confronted with the consequence of that choice made fully visible. "You're wearing imperial colors," Kael said finally. His voice was controlled and level, and she knew that voice, had lived inside the radius of that voice for 4 years, knew the specific quality of stillness it represented, the stillness of a man who is managing the speed at which he allows himself to understand something. "Yes," she said. "The Empire does not have jurisdiction in this hall." "Under standard pact territorial law, that's correct," she said. She looked at him steadily. "Under the bloodline provisions of the Imperial Charter, which predates the pact territorial agreements by 60 years, a recognized heir of the Ashen Line retains legal standing in any territory where the Empire holds treaty rights. The Shadowfang Pact signed a border treaty with the Empire 14 years ago." She paused. "Your father signed it, which means you ratified it when you inherited the Alpha ship." The silence in the room changed texture. "You have been busy," Kael said. "I had time." He looked at Lucian, who had positioned himself to her left and slightly behind, Not a subordinate position, but a flanking one, the specific positioning of a man who is there by choice rather than obligation. Something moved across Kael's face at that. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a recalculation. "This is a pack ceremony," Kael said. "You are interrupting." "I'm not interrupting," Celine said. "I'm arriving. There's a difference." She let that sit for a moment. Then, "I want to talk about your father's arrangement. 17 years ago. The child he agreed to keep and the man who paid him to keep her small." The room's silence deepened from very quiet to something else entirely. The silence of people who have been present at the moment a hidden load-bearing wall is removed and are waiting to see what falls. Kael's face went through something. She watched it. She had spent 4 years reading his face from the back of rooms and the far ends of tables, and she knew his full range by memory, every available expression, and what she saw now was something she had never seen on him before. Not bluster, not management, not the controlled contempt he had worn like armor every time she'd been in the room. Something older and more fundamental, the expression of a man who has spent years building a structure and has just heard the first sound of the foundation going. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," she said. "I've had 6 months and the full resources of the Imperial Archive. I know about the payment. I know about the arrangement. I know about the family and the lowland settlement, the people who were starting to understand what I carried. And I know what happened to them when your father decided they were a risk." She held his gaze. "I know what happened to my family, Kael." A sound went through the room. Not a shout, not a gasp, something below both, a collective breath drawn and held. Kael came out from behind the head table. He moved with the full weight of alpha authority, the room parting ahead of him the way rooms part ahead of that specific kind of presence, and he crossed the floor toward her with his jaw set and his gray eyes flat and his hands open at his sides. She held her ground. She did not step back. She watched him come and measured his pace and calculated the geometry of the space between them and felt her wolf rise in her chest like a tide responding to a known force. He stopped 6 feet from her. "You were sent on a mission," he said, low and direct, pitched for her rather than the room. "You were supposed to deliver a letter and come home." "You sent a man to make sure I didn't come home," she said at the same volume. "He is currently in Imperial custody answering questions about who gave his orders." A muscle in Kael's jaw moved. "The pack voted," he said. "The mission was assessed." "I was assessed," she said. "My life was assessed. In a room I wasn't allowed into, by people who had been managing my understanding of myself since I was 7 years old, for the benefit of an arrangement your father made with a man who wanted an imperial heir buried in a borderland pack where she would never amount to anything." She let her voice stay level throughout. Level was harder than loud. Loud anyone could do. Level required you to have already burned through the part of yourself that needed to scream and come out on the other side. That is what happened, and every person in this room is going to hear it. "You have no standing here." "I have every standing here," she said. "I have the standing of a woman who was born into it. I have the standing of an heir whose bloodline rights were suppressed by deliberate criminal conspiracy. And I have—" She paused. "I have standing that is walking through that door right now." The great hall doors opened again. The Imperial Archivist entered with 3 formal witnesses and 2 assistants carrying the documentation cases, the records, the payment ledgers recovered from Kael's father's private correspondence, the formal verification of Celine's bloodline mark, the full legal package assembled over 3 months in the Imperial Archive and notarized under Imperial law. The archivist was a small man who moved with the specific gravity of someone who understood that paper could be more lethal than steel when properly assembled. He set the documentation on the nearest table. He looked at Kael with the polite, implacable expression of a man who has delivered bad news many times and has learned to make it clean. "Alpha Draven," he said, "these materials will be registered with the Council of Pack Leaders under Imperial oversight. You are named specifically in sections 3 through 7. The pack leaders at the surrounding tables had been very still. Now one of them, the alpha of the Heartwall pack, a broad-shouldered woman named Cress, who had a reputation for blunt practicality, stood up. "I want to see the documentation," she said. Not to Kael, to the archivist. And that was the moment. Celine had known there would be a moment, a specific moment, when the room's allegiance shifted, when the weight redistribution became visible, when people began calculating based on the new information rather than the old structure. She had planned for it. She had known it would come. What she had not planned for was Reina. Reina Voss moved with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Not the moment of revelation, but the moment immediately after it, the 2-second window when every person in the room was looking at the archivist and the documentation and not at the head table. She came off the head table's platform with something in her hand that Celine registered a half-second too late. Not a weapon, not exactly. Something smaller, a vial, uncapped and already in motion. Celine moved. Her shadow shift was not fully engaged. Engaging it in a room this crowded with this many variables was a cost she had been consciously holding back, but she had enough of it active to pull the space between herself and the nearest dark corner. And she moved through it, wrong, not fully clean, the shift catching and fragmenting in a way it had never done in training. And she came out of the shadow 6 feet from where she intended and went down hard on one knee on the stone floor and felt the impact judder through her whole body. And then the pain hit. It was not physical. It was deeper. The specific quality of something targeted at the wolf rather than the body, hitting the part of her that had been sealed for 23 years and was still, even now, the youngest and most vulnerable part of what she was. She felt it as a cold compression, starting in her sternum and spreading outward, and her wolf, which had been fully present and fully available since the seal broke 3 months ago, flinched back from it as if burned. She had 1 second of complete clarity before the compression deepened. In that second, she understood everything. The vial was a suppression agent, targeted at the Ashen bloodline specifically, because you could not manufacture something that suppressed pack wolves with this kind of precision. This required someone who understood exactly what she was, exactly how her bloodline's power was structured, exactly where to hit it. This had been prepared specifically for her. This had been prepared in advance. Someone had known she was coming. Someone had known what she was. Someone inside the Imperial delegation. She felt Lucian's hand on her arm before she heard him move. He was beside her on the floor, one hand gripping her forearm, his voice low and completely controlled. Not asking if she was all right, because that was not the information he needed, saying, "Stay in your body. Don't let it push you out." She gripped his arm back and held. Around them, the room had erupted. The controlled choreography of the planned confrontation dissolving into the chaotic reality of a room full of alphas in a perceived crisis. Voices overlapping, warriors moving, the sharp sound of something ceramic shattering against stone as one of the documentation cases went over in the surge. She heard Kael's voice above the noise, and for the first time it had shed its control entirely. "Hold her. Hold the Imperial. Do not touch the air." Lucian's voice, standing now, pulling her to her feet beside him. Absolute zero temperature, no range above it. She got her feet under her. The wolf was still there. Compressed, pushed back, fighting the suppression agent with the full obstinacy of something that had been caged before and remembered exactly what that felt like. Not gone. Not gone. She held on to that with everything she had. Think, she told herself. The room is compromised. The documentation is on the table and the archivist is still standing and the pack leaders are still in their chairs and the plan is not destroyed. The plan has been interrupted and those are different things. They are different things. Find the shape of what is still intact and stand on it. She looked at Kael. He was 8 feet from her, 2 of his senior warriors flanking him, and his face had shed all its management now, and what was underneath it was older and rawer. The face of a man who has just watched his carefully maintained structure begin to come apart and has not yet decided whether to fight the collapse or run from it. "Who prepared it?" she said. Her voice came out strange, thinned by the suppression pressure, missing its lower register. She said it again. "Who prepared the agent? It wasn't you. You don't have the bloodline knowledge for that." Kael said nothing. "There is someone in my delegation," she said. "Someone who knew what I was and knew I was coming and knew what I was capable of. Someone who has been working against this from the inside." She held his gaze. "And you knew about them. You were in contact with them." Kael's eyes moved, just for a fraction. Not to Reina, away from her, deliberately away. The overcorrection of a man trying not to look at the thing he shouldn't look at. Selene followed the line he was avoiding. Elder Torin, was at the wall. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has spent a very long time being complicit in something and has just run out of the distance that complicity had kept between himself and its consequences. She understood it all in the time it took to breathe in. Torin. Old enough to have known her father, old enough to have been present at the original arrangement, positioned perfectly to monitor her for 4 years, to manage the reports that reached Kael, to identify the moment she began to understand her own nature, to communicate with whoever on the Imperial side had been maintaining the suppression network for 17 years, the guilty kindness, the absence that knew what it was absent from. The truest betrayals always came from people who had been kind to you. That was the thing about proximity, the thing about trust. You could not be truly destroyed by a stranger. Strangers could only kill the body. The things that dismantle the deeper architecture required someone who had stood close enough, long enough, to understand the load-bearing walls. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum. The wolf pushed back against the suppression agent with everything it had, raw and furious and deeply, specifically unwilling to go back into the dark. She looked at the room. She looked at the documentation on the table, still there, still intact. She looked at the pack leaders who had not moved from their chairs, watching with the calculating attention of people deciding which direction was up. She looked at Lucian, who was standing at her left with his hand no longer on her arm, but present, available, making no decision for her. She looked at Kael. She looked at Torin. The suppression agent was working. She could feel the wolf being pushed back incrementally, the shadow ability closing off like a fist tightening, and she knew with complete clarity that she had perhaps 20 minutes before she lost access to the things she had spent 3 months building, and that in those 20 minutes she had to either complete this or retreat. And retreating was not retreat. Retreating was surrender. And surrender meant this room, this moment, this entire architecture of reclamation dissolved into nothing, and Kael walked away from the documentation on that table and found a way to discredit it, and everything that had been taken from her stayed taken. She had come here to not be the same thing she was when she left. She was not going to leave the same thing she arrived. She looked at the wolf inside her own chest, compressed, furious, fighting. And she said the same thing she had said in the narrow room on the night she decided to go, the same thing she had said in the training yard at dawn, the same thing that had preceded every single thing she had built in the months since. Not yet. Then she let go of not yet. She opened everything. The suppression agent met the full uncompressed force of a 23-year-old bloodline power that had been sealed since infancy and had spent 3 months learning exactly what it was and was not, under any circumstances going back. The great hall went dark. Not the darkness of a room losing its lights. The lights were still burning, all of them. But the darkness of shadows suddenly present and aware and organized, pooling up from the floor and down from the rafters and in from the corners, filling the space between the torches with something that was not smoke and not fog, but was completely, unmistakably there. And in the center of it, Celine stood with her eyes open and the crown above her braided hair, and the wolf finally, fully arrived. The room did not make a sound. 200 alphas, warriors, pack leaders, and Imperial soldiers, and not one of them made a sound. Kael took one step back. It was involuntary. She could see that it was involuntary. The body's honest answer when the mind's authority over it breaks down. The step back of a man whose body has correctly assessed the situation before his ego has agreed to accept it. She looked at him across the dark hall, with the shadows moving around her like something alive. "Sit down," she said. And Kael Draven, alpha of the Shadowfang pack, sat down. The shadows held, and in the enforced silence of a room that had spent 4 years deciding she was nothing, Celine finally understood the full cost of what she had just done. Not the power, not the crown, not the documentation waiting on the table, but this. The moment you stop performing smallness, you can never go back to it. The person who walked into this room carrying 4 years of careful restraint did not exist anymore. What stood in this dark hall now was something that had been sealed before it could understand what it was, and had spent 23 years being told it was nothing, and had finally, in front of everyone who had ever believed that, decided to find out what nothing felt like from the other side. The answer was standing in the center of a silent room. The answer was the shadows. The answer was 200 alphas who could not look away. Outside, The autumn wind moved through the Shadowfang compound, and the silver wolf banners cracked and snapped against their poles. And somewhere in the document cases on the table, the full record of 17 years of deliberate theft waited to be read aloud. And Elder Torin had not moved from the wall, and Lucian had not moved from her left, and the suppression agent was burning away in the heat of what she had opened, and there was no version of what came next that looked like anything that had ever happened in this room before. She had not come back for revenge. But revenge, it turned out, was not always the point. Sometimes the point was simply this: to stand exactly where they told you that you couldn't and make them watch you do it. The shadows held for 11 seconds. She counted them the way she counted everything. Not consciously, but with the part of her that had always been running its calculations underneath whatever else was happening. The part that had kept her alive and functional in a place designed to make her neither. 11 seconds of 200 people not moving, not speaking, not doing anything except existing inside the fact of what she was. Then the room broke. Not violently, not all at once. It broke the way ice breaks on a river in early spring, one fracture line and then another, and then the whole surface in motion. The pack leaders at the surrounding tables were on their feet. Kael's senior warriors were looking at him, and then at her, and then at each other with the specific expression of people whose chain of command has just become a question rather than a certainty. 3 of the visiting alphas moved toward the documentation table with the focused attention of people who have decided that paper is more reliable than spectacle. Kael was still seated. She watched him find himself again, watched the moment his body's honest fear got overridden by the thing that had kept him in power for 8 years, that specific alpha refusal to accept the geometry of a situation that placed him below someone else. He stood. He stood slowly, with full deliberate weight, and he looked at her across the dark hall with his jaw set and his gray eyes stripped of everything except the oldest and most fundamental thing in them. "This is performance," he said, loud enough for the room. "Shadowcraft and Imperial Theater. She came here with a foreign emperor at her back and called it coming home." "Sit back down, Kael," said Alpha Crest from the Heartwall table, not looking up from the documentation she was reading. Her voice had the flat quality of someone who has already moved past the spectacle to the substance and is not interested in coming back. "The payment ledgers have your father's seal on every page. Those documents are fabricated." "I have been reading pack records for 30 years, Crest said. "I know your father's seal." She turned a page. Section 4 details the specific suppression arrangement for the heir's wolf. Your father's personal notation in the margin. She looked up. His handwriting. "I've seen it on 6 territorial agreements." The fracture lines multiplied. Celine let the shadows recede, not all at once, not as a concession, but gradually, the way a tide goes out on its own terms, and the hall's light returned to normal, and she stood in it the same way she had stood in the dark, which was the point. Light or dark, the thing she was did not change with the conditions. She had spent 4 years being a different version of herself depending on what the room required. She was done with that. She walked to the documentation table. She picked up Section 3, the payment records, the original arrangement, the specific notation that named Kael's father as the receiving party and detailed the terms under which one infant girl would be kept sealed, kept small, kept ignorant of everything she carried. She turned to face the room with it in her hand. "I'm going to read this," she said. "All of it. Every person in this hall is going to hear exactly what was purchased and what the purchase price was. And then we are going to talk about what the pact territorial agreements require when an alpha is found to have come to power through the suppression and criminal containment of an imperial heir. You don't have the authority." "She has every authority." Lucian's voice from her left. He had not moved from that position since the hall doors opened, left and slightly behind, flanking, present by choice, and his voice carried the absolute zero temperature she had heard him use twice before, both times in situations where the alternative to his words was something significantly worse. "Under the bloodline provisions she cited, under the Imperial Charter, under the Pact Territorial Treaty your father signed and you ratified, she has every authority in this room, including over you." Kael looked at Lucian with the specific look of a man who has spent years fearing something abstractly and is now experiencing it concretely and finding it exactly as bad as the abstract version promised. "This is an occupation," Kael said. "An imperial occupation disguised as—" "Your father sold a child," Selene said. The room went quiet again. different quality from before. Not the stunned silence of spectacle, but the heavy silence of a truth that has landed fully and cannot be picked back up. Your father sold a child, she said again, and she kept her voice level throughout, because level was the hardest register and the most devastating, because anyone could shout and shouting gave the target something to push back against. But level meant she had already been through the fire of it and come out the other side. And what she was saying was simply the truth, organized into sentences. He took payment to ensure that child never understood what she was. He arranged the deaths of the people who were starting to figure it out. He brought her into this pack and bonded her to his son, and spent 4 years watching her be diminished in this hall and in these corridors and at that table. She did not point at the servants' table, but every person in the room knew which table she meant. And when she became inconvenient, he sent her to die in enemy territory. That is the foundation of your alpha authority, Kyle. That is what you inherited and maintained and benefited from every single day. The silence after that was the longest one yet. Kyle moved. He did not come at her directly. She had known he wouldn't, known it from the way he'd stood and the way his eyes had moved, the calculation she'd watched him run in real time because she had read his face across enough rooms to know his processing speed. He went for Lucian. It was not tactically sound. It was the move of a man whose options have narrowed to the point where violence feels like the only remaining language, which meant it was the move of a man who had already lost and knew it, and was choosing combustion over surrender. She registered all of this in the time it took him to cover the first 3 feet. Lucian did not move back. He moved forward, which was what made him dangerous in ways that the accounts had tried and failed to fully capture. He did not have the pack wolf's physics, the enhanced speed and mass, but he had something that Celine had watched him demonstrate exactly twice in the months she'd known him, once in the training yard and once against an Imperial defector who had made the mistake of believing proximity was the same as advantage. He had the absolute economy of a man who had been in enough genuine violence to strip it of everything except what worked. Kale was faster. He was always going to be faster. But Lucian was ready, and ready beats fast by a wider margin than anyone who hasn't needed to learn that lesson ever believes. She watched Lucian take the impact, redirect it, use Kael's momentum against him with the cold efficiency of a man applying physics rather than strength. And Kael hit the stone floor on one knee and came back up immediately because he was an alpha, and alphas came back up. And then the warriors moved, Kael's warriors, 6 of them, converging on Lucian from multiple directions with the coordinated speed of a pack acting on a single instinct. The Imperial escort came off the walls. The Great Hall became a different kind of room. Celine was moving before she had consciously decided to move, her body running ahead of her thoughts the way it had learned to do over 3 months of training that had specifically been designed to burn the gap between intention and action until the gap was not there. And she hit the shadow shift hard and came through it clean on the other side of the nearest warrior before he had finished turning, and she put him down with the leverage point behind the knee and the combined weight of her forward momentum, and was moving again before he landed. She was not the most powerful thing in this room. She knew that. The math of 8 alpha wolves against 40 Imperial soldiers and 1 heir with 3 months of training was not comfortable math. What she had instead of power was information. She knew where everyone was. She had been tracking positions since she walked through the door, and she knew which bodies connected to which decisions. And the decision she needed to interrupt was the one happening 15 feet to her left, where 2 of Kael's senior warriors had gotten between Lucian and the exit corridor in a way that was going to cost him options he needed to keep. She hit the shadow shift again. Shorter this time, more controlled, the wolf burning fuel at a rate she was tracking with the back of her mind. Knowing the suppression agent's residue was still in her system, and that she had a finite reserve and that she needed to spend it on the things that mattered, and nothing else. She came through between Lucian and the corridor, both warriors turning toward her with the fractional hesitation of fighters recalibrating a target, and she said to Lucian without looking at him, "Left door, 30 seconds. Go." He went. She heard him go. She did not watch him go because she was occupied. The 2 warriors were professionals, and they were pack-enhanced, and she was neither of those things, and the 47 seconds that followed were not clean. She took an elbow to the jaw that sent white light across her vision, and a grabbed wrist that she had to break the grip on by going through it rather than against it, which cost her skin and cost her the wolf's fuel reserve faster than she wanted it to. But she had 3 months of course training in her body, and she had 4 years of living in a hostile environment that had taught her, down to the cellular level, how to function at a deficit, how to keep operating when the resources were gone, how to find the next available inch of ground and stand on it, how to refuse to go down, not because the body wasn't signaling strongly that going down would be easier, but because she had made a decision before she walked through these doors about what kind of woman she was going to be on the other side of today. And that decision did not include the floor. She came out of it with both warriors contained, not defeated, not permanently down, but out of the immediate equation, and blood from her split lip on her chin and her breathing running hard and ragged in a way she was going to have to manage carefully for the next phase. The room had reorganized itself. The Imperial soldiers had formed a perimeter. The pack warriors who had engaged were separated from those who hadn't, and the ones who hadn't were making very deliberate choices about continuing to not engage, which was its own information. 3 visiting alphas were on their feet at the documentation table, forming a tight group around the papers, protecting them, she realized, with a specific quality of gratitude she filed for later. Cress was one of them. Kale was at the center of the room. He had taken damage. Lucian had left marks, good ones, and one of the Imperial soldiers had added to them in the general chaos. But he was standing, and he was fully shifted from the waist up, the wolf's strength running through him visibly, and he was looking at Celine with the look she had never seen on his face before today, and had imagined, in the back of her mind, for a long time, without letting herself know she was imagining it. The look of a man who has finally, fully run out of the ability to manage her. "This ends here," he said. Not to the room, to her. "Yes," she said. "It does. You want a duel." He said it with the absolute flatness of a man who has arrived at the only available remaining piece of solid ground. "Fine. You want to call it a formal challenge under pack law. I'll give you that. No Imperial soldiers, no documentation. You and me." She looked at him. She looked at the man who had stood at the altar 4 years ago and bonded himself to her in a ceremony that meant nothing to him and had meant something to her before she learned what it actually was. She looked at the man who had looked away first in the courtyard on the morning she rode out to die, who had sat in the room where her life was assessed and said nothing on her behalf, who had inherited a crime his father committed and chosen every single day to maintain it because the maintenance was profitable, and the alternative required him to see her as a person rather than a managed variable. She thought about what a person becomes when the thing they have always been told they are, worthless, weak, nothing, turns out to be a deliberate architecture built to contain what they actually are, the specific violence of it. Not the violence of blows or dismissal, but the violence of a false ceiling constructed so carefully that you spend years pressing against it and concluding the ceiling is your natural height. She thought about the wolf that had been sealed before she could understand what sealing meant. She thought about 23 years. A formal challenge under pack law requires a witness council and a declared grievance, she said. I have both. Every pack leader in this hall constitutes the witness council. My grievance is in the documentation on that table. Under pack law, I am entitled to name the terms. Kale's jaw was set. Name them. The moon altar, she said. 1 hour. No seconds, no interference. The outcome determines the alpha ship of the Shadowfang pack and your personal standing before the regional alliance. She paused. And Torin comes with us. He answers for his part in front of the same witness council. Silence. Kale looked at Torin. Torin was still at the wall. He had not moved throughout the entire hall sequence. Not when she revealed his involvement, not during the fighting, not when the documentation was spread on the table. He had stood with his eyes on the floor and his hands at his sides with the specific immobility of a man who has made his final peace with the arrival of something he had spent a long time knowing was coming. He looked up now when Kale looked at him. Torin, Kale said, low and warning. Don't, Torin said. Just that. His voice was old and tired and had in it the particular quality of a man who is done performing a thing he stopped believing in a long time ago. Kale's expression went through something fast and ugly. The altar, he said to Celine. Agreeing. She heard what was underneath the agreement. Not acceptance, but calculation. The specific calculation of a man who believes that removing witnesses and documentation and the organizational structure of the hall and reducing everything to the physical equation of two bodies on a stone altar under an open sky will return the advantage to him. He was still faster. He was still pack-enhanced in ways she was not. He believed the suppression residue was still in her system at a level that mattered. He was running the math he knew how to run, and the math said he could still win this. She let him run it. 1 hour, she said. She walked to Lucian, who was at the left door where she had told him to be, and she looked at his face, marked from the engagement but controlled, that precise, unwasted attention fixed on her. And she said, low enough for only him, I need you to keep the witness council intact. Whatever happens outside, the documentation stays protected and the pack leaders stay present. That is the non-negotiable. And you, he said, same volume. I'll be at the altar. He looked at her with those complicated gray eyes, and she looked back, and there was a moment, the same category of moment as the one in the training yard the night before departure, the one she had been putting in the unlabeled category for 3 months. And she made a decision about the category. Later, she told herself. Not today. Today has enough. The documentation is already witnessed and sealed, Lucian said. It doesn't require the duel to stand. You know that. I know. Then why? Because legal standing isn't the same as standing, she said. Because a piece of paper in a documentation case doesn't undo what this place did. Because there are 200 people in this hall who watched everything that happened here, and the thing they remember is what they see tonight. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to make them watch, he said. I'm going to make them see, she said. There's a difference. She left the hall. The moon altar sat on the high ground at the northern edge of the Shadow Fang compound. A flat stone platform 20 feet across, open to the sky, used for the pack's formal challenges and bonding ceremonies and leadership declarations going back further than the current pack house walls. She had stood at it once before, 4 years ago, in the autumn cold, in a ceremony that had dressed her in someone else's expectations of what she should be and called it a future. The stone was cold under her boots when she stepped onto it. The witness council arranged themselves in the surrounding circle, all 8 visiting alpha representatives, Cress in the front position, 2 of Lucian's senior imperial officers as neutral third parties. The Shadow Fang warriors who had stood down in the hall were present at the outer ring, watching with the expression of people who have not yet decided what they are watching for but know it matters. Torrens stood at the eastern edge of the circle, apart from the others, under the informal custody of an imperial officer who was not restraining him but was standing close enough to make the situation clear. He looked old in the outdoor light. He looked like what he was, a man who had told himself a story about what he was doing for so long that the story had become his whole interior and was now watching the story end in public. Kael stepped onto the altar from the opposite side. He had shed the formal ceremony coat. He was in fighting clothes, practical, no embellishment, and the alpha authority was fully present in how he moved, the specific mass and intention of a pack wolf in his prime. And she looked at him across the stone platform and ran the honest assessment without flinching from it. He was stronger. He was faster in his base form. He had been in more genuine fights than she had. She had 3 months of targeted training, a partially suppressed bloodline ability running on reserves, and 23 years of accumulated understanding of exactly what this man was and how he worked, which was not nothing, but which she held without illusion. Cress spoke from the witness position. Formal challenge, declared and witnessed under pack law. Luna Celine Vale of the Ashen Imperial bloodline against Alpha Kael Draven of the Shadowfang pack. Grievance documented and sealed, terms accepted by both parties. A pause. Begin. Kael came forward without preamble. He was good. She had known he would be good. Watching someone from the edges of practice grounds for 4 years gave you a complete catalog of their capabilities. And he came in with the controlled aggression of a man who had decided that fast and decisive was safer than measured, because measured gave her time, and time gave the bloodline ability room to work. He was right about that. He was making the correct tactical choice. She moved into the shadow shift and felt it catch, the suppression residue. Not gone yet. Not enough reserve to sustain it, only enough to fragment it. And a fragmented shift was worse than no shift because it telegraphed her position without the benefit of concealment. She came out of the attempt in the same place she'd started and took the first impact on her shoulder instead of her ribs because she'd seen it coming and angled for it, and the force of it drove her back 3 feet across the stone. She caught herself. He came again immediately. No space, no reset, which was correct, which was what she would have done in his position. And she ducked low under the second attack and went in close, inside his range where his leverage was reduced, and drove her elbow into the junction she knew from training, the same place she had hit the man in the contested land 6 months ago. Except Kyle was not that man, and what worked on a pack enforcer did not land clean on an alpha in full form. He took it, shook it off, looked at her with something in his face that was not contempt anymore. She took that, filed it. It was information. They went around the altar for 4 minutes, and she took damage and gave damage, and the wolf fought the suppression residue with every exchange, pressing outward in the spaces between the hits with the specific furious patience of something that knows what it needs and is dismantling every obstacle with methodical intention. Her lip had reopened from the haul. Her left arm was carrying a deep bruise from an impact in the second minute that had made her vision white at the edges. She was running on what was left after the haul, after the suppression agent, after 3 months of training that had been thorough but was not 4 years. She was losing the math. She knew it. She held it without drama, with the flat precision of someone doing accurate inventory in a crisis. This is what I have. This is what I need. This is the gap between them. Find the next available inch of ground and stand on it. Kale came in for the third time from the right, and she read the angle wrong. She read it wrong because her left arm was not responding at full speed, and the read required the arm's input. And the impact caught her across the jaw, and she went down. Stone under her palms, cold and absolute and real. She heard the witness circle, not sound exactly, more the quality of a held breath, the specific silence of people watching something they cannot look away from. She pressed her palms flat against the stone altar, and the wolf, which had been fighting the suppression residue for 6 months, since the border crossing, since the fortress, since the training yard at dawn, fighting the careful, deliberate cage that had been built around it before it knew what cages were, pushed through the last residue of the suppression agent with the force of something that had been patient long enough. It came through clean, all of it. Every sealed ability, every suppressed instinct, everything that had been locked below her sternum since before she could walk, arriving with the full, irreversible weight of 23 years of accumulated pressure finally finding its exit. She did not rise immediately. She stayed on her palms on the stone for exactly 2 seconds and felt it all arrive. Felt the shadow ability open fully for the first time without cost, without compression, without the constant friction of fighting her own suppressed nature to access what was already hers. Felt the wolf settle into her body, not as a visiting force, but as a resident one, as the thing she actually was, rather than the thing she had been managing from a distance her whole life. Then she stood up. Kyle was 4 feet away. He was looking at her with the expression she had been waiting for. Not the contempt, not the management, not the calculation. The expression underneath all of those, the one he had been keeping below them for 4 years because showing it would have confirmed something he had needed to not confirm. Raw recognition. The specific look of a man whose body understands the situation before his mind agrees to catch up. She looked back at him from inside the full weight of what she was. "You always knew," she said. Her voice was steady. The split lip and the jaw and the bruised arm were all fully present, and she held them without hiding them, because taking damage and standing in it was not weakness, it was the honest record of having been in something real. From the beginning, your father told you what I was, what I carried, and you chose every day to maintain it. Kyle said nothing. "Say it," she said. "Say it out loud, in front of the witnesses. What you knew and when you knew it." The great autumn sky above the stone altar was the specific gray of early evening, and the witness circle was utterly still, and somewhere in the outer ring the Shadowfang warriors were watching the man they had followed for 8 years stand on the altar he had stood on for every major decision of his leadership and failed to find a single word. Silence was its own answer. "Cress," Celine said, not looking away from Kael. "Witnessed," Cress said from the circle. The Alpha's silence constitutes formal acknowledgement under pack law in the presence of a declared grievance. Recorded. Kael's hands came up. Not in surrender. Oh, not yet. She could see that it wasn't yet. but in the position of a man who has decided that if he is going down, he is going down in motion, which was the only decision left available to him that still had the shape of a choice rather than a verdict. She watched his hands come up, and she understood, in the fraction of a second before he moved, that this was the moment. Not the last strike, whatever came next, whether she was fast enough or not, whether the wolf's reserves held or didn't, but this moment, right here, standing on this stone, in this coat, wearing this crown, with her split lip and her bruised arm, and the full, unrestricted presence of everything she was, watching the man who had decided she was nothing run out of everything he had used to maintain that decision. This was already the moment. Everything after was just the ending catching up to it. Kael came at her with everything he had left. And Celine Vale, heir of the Ashen Imperial bloodline, Luna of the Shadowfang pack, woman who had been sent to die and had come back as something the pack had no name for yet, let the shadows rise around her like a living thing and moved to meet him. The shadows took him clean, not brutally. She had made a decision about brutality somewhere in the second minute on the altar, in the space between one impact and the next, in the narrow corridor between what she was capable of and what she was willing to be. She had the full bloodline power now, unrestricted, the shadow ability running at depth she had not yet fully measured, and she could feel the upper range of it, the way you feel the edge of a cliff in the dark, present, absolute, requiring respect rather than exploration. She did not use the upper range. She used exactly what the situation required and nothing beyond it. She took Kael down with the shadows as a containing force rather than a destructive one, wrapping the darkness around his legs, his chest, neutralizing the alpha speed that had been his primary advantage, and when he hit the stone altar it was controlled, his body's impact managed rather than abandoned to physics. He landed hard but not broken. He landed the way a man lands when someone has made a choice about what kind of person they are on the other side of this. He lay on the stone and breathed. She stood over him and breathed too, her chest working in hard pulls, the bruised arm and the split lip and the jaw fully present and accounted for. Everything hurting with the honest, specific quality of a body that has been in something real and is now in the process of surviving it. The witness circle was silent. Kael looked up at her from the stone. His gray eyes, so like and so unlike Lucian's, she thought. The same color and completely different architecture. One built for management and one built for something else entirely. Were stripped of everything. No contempt, no calculation, no performance. Just a man on the cold stone of the altar he had stood on for 8 years, looking up at the woman he had spent 4 years deciding was nothing, understanding finally and fully, and too late, what nothing actually looked like. "Yield," Cress said from the witness circle. Not a question, a formal declaration requiring a formal response. Kael closed his eyes. A long moment. "Yielded," he said. The word came out rough, like it cost him something structural to produce it, like some load-bearing element of himself was going out with it. It was. She stepped back. She stepped back not because she was done with him. She had more to say, and she would say it. But because standing over a man who had already yielded was a different kind of power than the one she had come here to demonstrate. And she had been very specific with herself, in the archive room and the training yard and the long hours of preparation, about what kind of power she was willing to be. The kind that requires someone else to stay down was not it. She looked at Cress. "Witnessed and recorded." "Witnessed and recorded," Cress confirmed. Her voice had in it a quality that Celine did not try to name, something between respect and relief, the specific emotional register of watching a thing that needed to happen finally happen. Celine turned to the outer ring. The Shadowfang warriors were there, 30 of them, the men and women who had served under Kael's authority for years, who had participated in the daily architecture of her diminishment not through dramatic cruelty, but through the ordinary complicity of people who looked away, who didn't speak, who calculated their own standing against the cost of seeing her clearly and chose their standing every single time. She looked at them without anger. She had been through the anger somewhere in the past 6 months, had burned through it in training yards and archive rooms and long nights pressing her palm flat against her sternum, and what was left after the burning was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a different process, and it required more time and more distance than she currently had, but something that preceded forgiveness, The decision to see people as the full, complicated weight of what they were, rather than only the worst version of their choices. You served this pack, she said to them. You can continue to serve it. The pack doesn't end today. It changes leadership, and it accounts for what was done, and it moves forward. That is available to every person standing in this circle who chooses it. She paused. What is not available is pretending the documentation on the table inside doesn't exist. What is not available is loyalty to a structure built on what was done to me and to my family. You pick one or the other, not both. Silence. Then one of the warriors, young, one she recognized from her first year, a woman named Petra, who had never been cruel to her but had never been anything else either, stepped forward. Not toward Celine exactly, just forward, out of the line, the specific movement of someone separating themselves from a collective position, then another, then four more. It was not a tide. It was not a dramatic unanimous declaration. It was 6 people making individual decisions in public, which was harder than a tide and meant more. She turned back to Kael. He had gotten to his feet. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her, and his face had settled into something she had never seen on him. Not the stripped rawness of the moment after he yielded, but something older and quieter, the face of a man who has arrived at the end of a long argument with himself and found the argument resolved against him. The documentation names you as complicit in the arrangement, she said, in the suppression, in the deaths of the lowland family, in the deliberate management of my capabilities over 4 years. Under pack law, as attested by the Witness Council, those constitute grounds for stripping the alpha title. She looked at him steadily. I am invoking those grounds. Kael's jaw worked once. You're going to execute me. No, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to exile you, she said. Alone. No rank, no warriors, no pack standing. The wastelands to the north. The contested territory past the Grey Wall's second ridge. You'll have a horse and 3 days of provisions. Everything beyond that is your own problem. She paused. You're going to live with what you did, in a body that remembers every choice it made, in a silence that has no one left to manage. That is the sentence. The quality of the silence around the altar changed. She heard Cress exhale. Kyle looked at her for a long time. She did not look away, and neither did he. And what passed between them in that sustained eye contact was not forgiveness and not hatred, but something more permanent than either. The final honest accounting between 2 people who have spent years in the same space, failing each other in different directions, laid out and completed and sealed. You could have killed me, he said. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? She considered the question. She gave it the weight it deserved, because it was a real question, and the man asking it was, underneath everything, a real person, and the answer she gave was going to outlast this altar and this moment and this cold autumn sky. Because killing you would have made today about you, she said, and today is not about you. He nodded once, a single slow nod, and in it she saw something she had not expected and could not quite name. Not gratitude, nothing so clean, but the complicated response of a man being shown a standard he had never held himself to and understanding too late to use it that it was possible to hold it. He walked off the altar. He did not look back. She watched him go with the wolf steady in her chest and the shadows quiet around her feet and the cold evening air on her face, and she felt the full weight of the moment settle. Not triumph, not relief. Those were too simple and too clean, but something more complex and more permanent. The specific gravity of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time, being made right in the only imperfect way available to actual human circumstances, which is never perfectly and never without cost. The cost was present. She held it. She went back inside. The Great Hall was a different room from the one she had walked into 3 hours ago. The documentation was still on the table, witnessed and sealed. The visiting pack leaders were gathered around it in small clusters of 2 and 3, talking quietly with the focused quality of people working through significant implications. The Imperial escort had stood down from its combat posture and was distributed around the room's perimeter with the professional neutrality of soldiers who have done their job and are now waiting for the next instruction. Torin was seated at the end of the long table where she had eaten breakfast alone for 4 years. He was seated in exactly the position she had always sat, at the far end, apart from the main clusters, the position of someone who has been designated peripheral. She did not think he had chosen it deliberately. She thought he had gone there because it was the only place in the room that felt appropriate to him now, which told her something about the things guilt knew without being told. She sat across from him. He looked at her. His hands were flat on the table. His face had the texture of old stone, something that had been through a great deal of weather and had stopped expecting the weather to stop. "How long?" she said. "Since before you were born," he said. "I knew your father, the real one, before the raid." He stopped, started again. "I was younger then. I told myself the arrangement was the safest option for you. That being here, sealed and hidden, was better than the alternative." "The alternative being?" "The people who ordered the raid were still looking for you. Whoever paid your father's arrangement fee was not the only party interested in the heir." He looked at his hands. "I told myself I was protecting you. By the time I understood I was managing you, I had been managing you long enough that the difference had collapsed." She looked at him. This was the thing about people who had been kind to her in the particular complicit way Torin had been kind. She could not look at him without feeling both the genuine warmth he had occasionally offered and the full weight of what that warmth had coexisted with, side by side in the same man, neither canceling the other. People were not simple. They were not simply good or simply monstrous. They were the full complicated record of every choice they had made in every pressurized moment they had ever encountered. And some of those choices were generous, and some were cowardly, and some were both simultaneously, and the account did not balance clean. "The name," she said. "The person who ordered the original raid, who wanted me found." Torin was quiet for a long moment. "There was a faction within the Empire," he said carefully, "before Lucian consolidated. People who believed the heir, if found and controlled, could be used to challenge his authority. They are not... most of them are not still active. His consolidation eliminated the majority of them." "Most," she said. "One," Torin said. "One I am still uncertain about. I have a name. I will give it to you." He paused. "And then I will answer whatever the witness council requires of me. I am not going to run." She looked at him for a long moment. The old man who had watched her for 4 years with the guilty kindness of someone who has made a deal they can no longer fully justify and can no longer escape. The man who had stood in the council corridor and said "safe travel" in the voice of someone offering the smallest available true thing. "Give the name to Lucian," she said, "tonight, before you give your account to the council." He nodded. She stood. She found Lucian in the archive room. Of course he was in the archive room. She had known that was where he would be without having to look anywhere else first, because she had spent 6 months learning the shape of how this specific man moved through spaces and where he went when he was processing something. And he went to information the way she went to information, which was one of the first things she had noticed about him, and had filed in the unlabeled category and had been leaving alone for reasons that no longer applied. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. He was standing at the table with one of the documentation cases open, not reading it actively, but with his hand on the page in the posture of a man who has been thinking rather than reading and has been using the document as an anchor for the thinking. He looked up when she appeared. He looked at her, at the split lip and the jaw, and the bruised arm, and the crown still above her braided hair, and the shadows quiet around her feet. And something moved through his face that was not the controlled winter gray expression she had spent 6 months learning to read past. Something that was underneath the controlled expression. Something that had been there for a while, she now understood, sitting in its own unlabeled category while they both carefully attended to everything else. "Kael," he said. "Exiled," she said. "North, alone." He was quiet for a moment. "The council will want more." "The documentation is the more. He's stripped of his title and standing. That's the legal structure. The exile is separate." She paused. "It was my call to make." "Yes," he said. It was. She came fully into the room. She sat in the chair she had sat in 6 months ago when he had told her the truth about her mark in the flat, precise register of a man who had decided information was more respectful than comfort, and she felt the full accumulated weight of the day settle into her body, the bruises and the exhaustion and the specific kind of emotional depletion that follows a sustained confrontation with every important truth you have been building toward for a very long time. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum. The wolf was quiet. Not absent. Never absent again, she now understood. That was the thing about the seal breaking. There was no resealing. The wolf was simply resident now, permanent, hers, but quiet in the way of something that has finished a long journey and has arrived somewhere it intends to stay. Torin has a name for you, she said. Someone from the original faction. He'll give it to you tonight. Lucian nodded. He did not ask about the larger conversation she'd had with Torin. He had the specific intelligence of a man who knew when information would be offered without extraction and was patient enough to wait for it. She looked at him. You stayed in position the whole time, she said. In the hall, at the altar. You didn't move past what I asked. No? Most people would have. Most people, he said, don't understand that acting for someone without their consent is not the same as acting for them. She held his gaze. Where did you learn that? He was quiet for a moment. From watching what happens when people don't. The archive room held its particular smell of old bark and dust, and the faintly mineral thing she had never identified, and the lamp burned steady between them, the way it had burned steady on the night 6 months ago, when he had told her what the mark on her skin meant. And she thought about the distance between that night and this one. Not in miles or months, but in the specific internal distance between the woman who had pressed her back against the wall of a holding room in an enemy fortress, and the woman sitting in this chair now. And she found that distance was not something she could measure anymore. You could not step back far enough from the person you had become to see the shape of the change from outside it. You could only feel it from inside. The different quality of the ground under you, the different weight of your own hands in your lap. The regional alliance, she said. The pack leaders will want answers by morning, a structure, something to replace what came down today. Yes. I want to build it with you, she said, not under you. Not beside you in the way that means one step behind and one step down. With you. Equal standing, equal authority, the pack territories and the empire under a shared charter that neither of us can override unilaterally. Lucian looked at her. That is a significant political restructuring, he said. I know what it is. The Imperial Council will have objections. I know that too. He was quiet for a long moment, and she let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not pressurized, just the space two people hold when they are both in the process of choosing something and want to choose it honestly rather than quickly. The Imperial throne has a consort provision, he said finally, an equal partnership designation. It hasn't been used in 4 generations. The legal architecture exists. A pause. If you wanted to use it. She looked at him steadily. I'm not talking about a consort provision, she said. I'm talking about a restructured charter. Political architecture. That's the conversation I'm proposing. Something in his face moved. Not disappointment, not retrenchment, but the specific expression of a man being held to precision by someone who knows the difference between what is being offered and what is being asked, and respecting both the distinction and the person making it. Then, yes, he said, the political architecture. We build it together. And the other conversation, she said, the other one, that happens after, when there's time and distance from today. He held her gaze. After, he said. And the word had in it something settled, something that was not a deferral but a genuine commitment to the sequence. After, when the ground was clear enough to stand on without the day's weight, pulling everything toward urgency. When both of them could choose what they chose with full information and full presence, and no crisis requiring them to collapse the timeline. After, she said. She stood. She went to the archive table and spread the territorial maps. The same maps, her charcoal marks still on them from 6 months ago. The first marks she had made in this pack's records that had been worth the making. And she began to work. Lucian came to stand beside her. They worked through the night. The morning came in through the archive's narrow windows with the gray and gold quality of autumn light. And by the time it reached the table, they had the framework of the charter laid out in 3 separate documents, argued over and revised and argued over again, the specific productive friction of 2 intelligences that disagreed on principles but agreed on precision and were not afraid to push back on each other, which was the only kind of work that produced something worth building on. She went to the great hall at first light. The pack leaders were there. Most of them had not slept, or had slept briefly and uncomfortably on the pack house furniture, and they had the specific quality of people who have been through something large and are now in the aftermath of it, ready for the next weight to be assigned so they know how to carry it. Cress stood when Celine entered. Not ceremony, just the instinctive response of a woman who had been watching all night and had reached her own conclusions. "The charter," Cress said. "Cressim's draft," Celine said. "Open for revision and input from all PAC representatives. Nothing is finalized until the full council has reviewed it." She set the documents on the table. "The Shadow Fang PAC will be administered under interim council leadership pending the establishment of the new alliance structure. I am not installing myself as alpha of this PAC. I am restructuring the authority above the PAC level so that no single alpha can acquire the kind of unchecked power that enabled what was done here." Silence. "You're proposing a council of alphas," said the Hartwall representative. "I'm proposing a council of alphas with a defined charter, imperial oversight, and an escalation structure for disputes that does not end in whoever is biggest winning by default," she said. "Yes." The Hartwall representative looked at the documents, looked at Cress, looked at Celine. "I'll read it," he said. She stood at the head of the table where she had never been allowed to stand and watched the PAC leaders read the framework she and Lucian had built in an archive room overnight. And she felt the wolf in her chest steady and present and fully hers. And she felt the crown on her head with the weight of something that had always belonged there. And she felt the bruised arm and the split lip and the jaw, all of them present, all of them part of the record of how she had gotten to this room in this coat on this morning. And she did not try to minimize any of it. Cora had told her in the first week of training, the body remembers everything it survives. That was not a comfort, and it was not a warning. It was simply true. Everything the body had been through was written in it permanently, and the writing was not damage, it was information. It was the ongoing record of a person who had been in something real and had come through it, and coming through it was not the same as being unaffected by it. She was affected by all of it. She carried all of it. She stood at the head of the table and carried it with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on the people reading her work and her wolf quiet in her chest. And she thought about what it had taken to stand here. Not the power, not the bloodline ability, not the 3 months of training or the 6 months of archive work or the careful, deliberate building of every tool she had used yesterday. Those had been necessary. They had not been sufficient. What had been sufficient was the decision she had made in the narrow room of the Shadowfang pack house on the night the mission was assigned, and in the fortress holding room, and in the training yard at dawn, and on every morning of the past 6 months when she had gotten up and done the work. The decision to treat her own survival as worth the effort. The decision to take seriously the question of what she actually was, instead of accepting the answer other people had constructed for her. The decision to move toward the thing she carried rather than away from it. That was not a lesson she could package and hand to someone. It was not a truth that could be transferred by saying it. It was only available through the doing of it, through the specific sequence of choices that led a person from being managed to being present. And the sequence was different for everyone, and the cost was different for everyone, and the timeline was its own business. But it was available. That was the thing she had not known before this year. She had known a great many things, had cataloged and cross-referenced and analyzed with the diligent precision of a woman who had learned early that knowledge was the currency she could actually accumulate. But she had not known this, that the thing they had sealed was available, that what had been taken could be reclaimed, that the floor disappearing was not the same as the fall being the end of the story. The fall was just the fall. What came after was the thing that mattered. Elder Torin gave his account to the Witness Council that morning. He gave it fully, with the specific dignity of a man who has decided that the one remaining honest act available to him is to be completely honest. The name he gave Lucian the night before turned out to be a junior Imperial archivist who had been feeding information to the remnant faction for years, a loose end that Lucian's intelligence officers were already in the process of addressing by the time the council session ended. Torin did not ask for leniency. The council gave him supervised exile to the southern territories rather than the wastelands, which was the difference between judgment and cruelty, and which Celine did not contest. She did not attend the full session. She went outside. She walked to the edge of the compound where the stone wall met the hillside, and the view opened to the south. The contested lands in the middle distance, the gray wall ridgelines beyond, the whole complicated geography of the territory she had ridden through 6 months ago, with a compromised mission and a sealed wolf, and the absolute certainty that she had no ground left to stand on. The wolf stood with her in the morning air. After a while, she heard footsteps behind her, and she knew the weight and rhythm of them before she turned, because she had been memorizing that footstep since the night in the training yard when she had finally stopped pretending she wasn't. Lucian came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a while. Not the pressurized silence of a room full of difficult truths, the simple silence of two people standing in the morning air after a long night, with the contested lands below them and the work ahead of them, and the particular quality of a moment that exists in the breathing space between what has been resolved and what comes next. The council will need a formal ratification session, he said. 3 weeks, she said. Enough time for the regional representatives to return with their full council's input. The imperial ratification will run parallel, he said. My council will object to sections 2 and 4 specifically. I know, she said. I wrote sections 2 and 4 specifically so they would object to them. If they push back hard enough, we'll end up at the compromise position, which is where I actually wanted to land. A pause. You wrote the objections into the draft on purpose, he said. I spent 6 months in your archive, she said. I read the full record of your council's negotiating patterns going back 12 years. Another pause. Something in it that had a different quality from the political conversation. Something that recognized what it was recognizing without insisting on making it loud. After, he said. After, she said. They stood in the morning air and looked at the territory below them, which was going to require enormous, sustained work, and was going to be difficult, and was going to produce friction, and was going to involve a great many conversations in archive rooms, and council chambers, and training yards, and across maps spread on tables at all hours. It was going to require two people who were willing to push back on each other and hold each other to precision and trust each other's judgment, even when it ran against their own instinct, and to keep choosing the hard version of things rather than the version that was easier but smaller. She was willing. She looked at the gray wall ridgelines in the morning light and thought about the girl who had ridden through those ridges 6 months ago. Worn boots, sealed wolf, letter bearing a seal of a man who had already decided what she was worth. That girl had known exactly one thing with real certainty, that the version of herself available inside the walls of the Shadowfang packhouse was not the full version, that something more was possible, even if she could not see its shape. She had been right. The shape had turned out to be this, not the crown or the charter or the defeated alpha on the stone altar, though it included all of those. The shape was the interior thing, the wolf fully present in her chest, the decisions made from her own center rather than from the edges of other people's expectations, the ground under her feet that was hers because she had built it rather than because someone had permitted her to stand on it. The compound was waking behind them. Voices, movement, the organized sound of a large structure rerouting itself through a changed morning. Somewhere inside, the pack leaders were reading the charter. Somewhere inside, Torin was giving his account. Somewhere in the northern wastelands, or not yet there, a man was riding alone with 3 days of provisions and the full weight of his own history as the only company he had. She had not exiled Kael for him. She had understood that clearly on the altar. She had exiled him for the same reason she had made every decision since the narrow packhouse room, because it was who she had chosen to be, and the choosing was the thing, the central and irreducible thing, the only thing that was ever actually hers to make. The morning held. The wolf held. She had spent 23 years learning that the person she was had been wrong, small, insufficient, sealed below the level of her own true form. She had spent the last 6 months learning what the true form was. She expected she would spend the rest of her life learning what to do with it, which was not a daunting prospect but a clarifying one. The understanding that becoming was not a destination but a direction, and that she finally, at 23 years old, standing on a hillside in the autumn morning with the wolf in her chest and the crown above her braided hair, and the man who had helped her find her own ground standing at her left, was pointed the right way. She was not finished. She was not the same. She was, for the first time in her life, entirely and irreversibly herself. Below them, the territory waited. She turned and walked back toward the work.